CD4.
There was definitely fear on Kieran's face when she pointed out the risk of jail. Then, the suggestion that he could bring trouble to Zoe, that was the clincher. He would want to protect the princess. Sheena had managed to scare him sufficiently. He would go along with the plan. "Okay," she said. "Take my watch so you can keep track of the time. 10 o'clock. Be back here and we go." "Thank you. Yes. Thank you, Sheena." And he disappeared through the orchard on his way to find Zoe. It didn't take long for Sheena to finish packing. Their piss-weak pile of possessions only half filled her backpack and Kieran's sports bag. She stripped the sheets off the 2 mattresses and rolled them into an efficient bundle for Celia to wash. Maybe there would be 2 new pickers staying in this cabin after they'd gone, and those people deserved clean sheets if they were going to work their asses off picking peaches. She swept bits of grass and leaves off the tiny floor area of the cabin and out the door using the edge of one of Kieran's thongs. Very quickly, Sheena exhausted the jobs that needed doing. She lay down on the bare mattress, figuring it might be good to get an hour or 2 of sleep, to bank up energy to drive once she had the car back. The smartest plan was to drive all night, to transport Kieran rapidly away from this place and from Zoe. Judging from the parade of destructive behaviour Sheena had observed so far in her life, people were more likely to make moronic decisions during the night, in the dark. Kieran was a shocker for such misguided nighttime choices. She could envisage her brother hurling himself out of the car window onto the pitch-black embankment of the country road in order to run back to Zoe, howling like a mongrel dog. But if Sheena could just keep him sitting in the car long enough, hopefully sleeping, hurtling along that highway through the night, then when the dawn came, he would be more likely to see the sense of the thing. It turned out there was no way Sheena could sleep now. Because of that sweaty nap earlier and because her bones were gritty, scraping inside her flesh with self-loathing, she was lonely, cranky and worn out from making decisions on her own for so long. Mostly lonely. She thought about Kieran and Zoe holding each other right at this minute, skin to skin. It would be good to have that for a moment. However self-deluded you'd have to be to think it solved anything. But it would be good to have that for a little while. After 10 minutes of that soft-headed, self-pitying rubbish, Sheena shook herself back to the thumping reality of how things worked on the surface of the planet. It struck her she might be sweating on the bare mattress. So she jumped up, untied the bundle of bedding and put one of the fitted sheets back on. But then, instead of lying back down on the bed, she decided some fresh air might help her toxic mood. She dragged the esky across to wedge open the cabin door, then sat on the front step, gazing out into the dark orchard. She might as well make the most of her last hours here. She'd never spent time in the country as a kid, and as an adult, she'd always felt out of place in a rural setting, as if her presence there was a distasteful or laughable mistake. The old Hungarian lady said that when you worked hard on a piece of land and the sweat from your labour had soaked into its soil, you grew a connection to that land. Sheena was not taken in by such mystic bullshit, but she had to concede she felt some affection for this farm now, a sense that she had some right to be here after the hours of shredding work she'd put into it. Part of her was sorry to be leaving. Admittedly, a very small part that was crusted around with resentment. Some minutes later, Sheena heard footsteps swishing across the wet, mulchy stuff on the orchard ground. It wouldn't be Kieran. She didn't expect him back until the agreed time. So it must be Celia, wanting to check things were going to plan. Then Sheena realised Joe was the one walking towards the cabin. "Hi," he said. "I left your car down by the gate." "Right. I guess I should say thanks." Joe dropped his head down a little. Was that a smile on his face? What the fuck did that look mean? What had Celia been saying to him? Joe had always appeared less judgy about her than she expected a guy like him to be. He had even, amazingly, seemed respectful towards her. Had that soured now he had more information? Did Joe reckon she and Kieran were low-life scum? Well, whatever. Sheena didn't have the emotional stamina to take that on right now. As he stood at the cabin door, she asked him, "How will you get back into town?" "I'll stay the night at my mother's. Wouldn't mind escaping my place for a bit." Sheena wasn't sure if that was an invitation to ask further questions about his home life. It was better to keep her snout out of his business, so she responded with a non-committal tip of the head. "Where's Kieran?" asked Joe. "He'll be back soon, then we'll head off. Don't worry. Kieran knows he doesn't have any choice unless he wants to get arrested." "What time is it?" "A bit after 8. Joe came close enough to drop the car key into her hand. Then, to Sheena's surprise, he gestured at the empty section of the step. "Can I sit there?" She shuffled sideways to make room for him beside her. "You know, Sheena, you made things harder for Kieran by helping him skip town. By the time I found him, he'd already missed those court dates." Joe nodded. "Well, the cops want to talk to him about some other matters now." "Oh, right. Doesn't surprise me." "The vet science lab." "Yeah, those morons stole a shitload of drugs the vets use. The security guard wasn't supposed to be there at the time." Joe nodded, letting Sheena run off at the mouth. "But the guard was there," she said, "and then, I don't know exactly, Mick laid into him, beat the poor guy up pretty badly, from what Kieran told me. And Kieran was part of it. Not the bashing, I don't reckon, but he was there, trailing after Mick like a brain-damaged puppy. With Kieran's record, he'd end up in jail for a serious deal like that, wouldn't he?" "Most likely, yes. Look, the best move is for Kieran to hand himself in to the police." "Maybe so, but I'm worried he'll get blamed for all the stuff Mick did. Kieran would blab out more than he should, make things worse for himself, and end up in jail for a long time." "I get what you're saying, but..." "And jail for a soft kid like Kieran? Sure, I know. He needed rescuing. I rescued him," Sheena said flatly. She waited for Joe to rip into her short-sighted strategy, but instead of doing that, he flopped his head back with a weary smile. "What will you do now?" he asked. "What were you doing before the car broke down? Drive around, doing big figure eights on the map." "But in the long run, what?" "I'm hoping the cops get their paws on Mick sometime soon and he soaks up some of the blame. Make things easier for Kieran. Meanwhile, my job is keep my brother alive and out of major trouble." Sheena knew that sounded pretty feeble. She knew it wasn't much of a plan. But Joe didn't try to argue her out of it. He just said, "Well, good luck." Sheena was waiting for Joe to get up and go, but he stayed there, sitting beside her on the step. It was nice to have another human being, other than Kieran, to talk to. With the police trouble out in the open and the decision to leave the farm already in place, she could afford to let her guard drop. And anyway, she was sick to death of the effort it took to keep that guard up. "The last couple of weeks, Kieran's been so grounded. Really got into the work," said Sheena. "But I don't know. I've always been scared my little brother is doomed." "I don't think he's doomed." She wanted to believe Joe was right about that. It was incredible to hear another person, a sensible person, say it. Listening to this man offer a smidgen of hope for Kieran made the wretchedness come rushing up from her belly to tighten around her throat. "He'll hate my guts for making him leave. Oh, yeah," said Sheena, attempting a laugh. "The next few weeks are going to be seriously shitful. Kieran miserable, blaming me feeling like a bitch." And now there was no way she could stop her voice trembling. Joe fumbled in the inside pocket of his suit jacket to retrieve one of those small packets of tissues. He was the kind of guy who carried little packs of tissues in his pocket. He probably never even used them himself. He probably just kept them on hand in case some sneezing child or injured elderly gent or weeping woman needed a tissue. Right now, Sheena was the weeping woman. She pulled a tissue from the packet, bunched it up, and pressed it against her eyes to blot up the tears. "Thanks," she said. "You're a kind man." "You reckon?" "Not so sure about that." "At least you think about what's going on for other people." Joe puffed out a defeated breath. For all the good that does. Well, it's more than the self-obsessed dicks out there in the world ever do. Maybe. You know, one of the things I really like about your brother, he thinks the best of everyone. Huh. He does do that. But it means they take advantage of him. He doesn't know what people are really after. But you do? Yes, I do, replied Sheena emphatically. They still end up taking advantage of me, but... Sheena pulled a stupid face, and Joe laughed. I've been a tiny bit jealous, she said. Watching Kieran and Zoe with their pashing and staring into each other's eyes and all that shit. Kidding themselves, obviously. Sheena instantly regretted speaking that way to him. She was an idiot. Joe shook his head, staring out into the orchard, not looking at her, and she worried she'd offended him somehow. What? She asked him. The way you look at me, like you can see every dark secret in here. He tapped his own forehead. I can't really. It's a trick I do with my face. I know bugger all about what's going on in people's heads, but pretty much everyone's got dark shit inside them, so if you do this look... She demonstrated a suspicious, slit-eyed stare. The other person's mind does the rest, and they imagine I'm onto them. That's a trick. It works. Yeah, freaks people out. Sometimes they blurt stuff out without me doing anything. Joe frowned, as if doing a quick audit of his own mind. I've never gone in for blurting stuff out. Too careful. Too much in the habit of filtering every single thing that comes out of my mouth, making sure there's no risk anyone could get hurt. Well, that's a good way to be, said Sheena. Better than being a tactless fucking big mouth. Is it though? Or is it just fucking repressed? He grinned at her with a boldness she hadn't seen from him before. Then he dropped his face away. But the thing is, I've got responsibilities. I've got people I have to worry about. I've got history I have to remember. You get used to censoring yourself. He looked back at her. Do you understand? Sheena was aware of the history he was talking about. She knew stuff about his parents. She knew Celia's story. She'd heard the tales from Rosa. And even if she couldn't entirely understand, she wanted him to feel understood. So she nodded. He went on. After a while, after always talking yourself into the responsible choice, you end up talking yourself out of impulses. You lose connection with your own... I can't explain it. Sorry. Nah, I think I get you. Joe looked at her intently for a moment, as if working out another way to explain himself. Then he suddenly slid along the bench and kissed her. Sheena remembered thinking Joe was a good-looking man when they had first met on the outskirts of Narralong. She had been marooned with her piece of shit car rolled onto the roadside dirt, farting grey smoke. Her little brother wandered off into the neighbouring paddock, trying to lure the sheep to him by offering them twisties. Joe had pulled his car over and gave them a lift to the mechanic in town. On the drive, he had chatted to Kieran with a simple courtesy that made her ache with gratitude. Later, once the car had been towed into town, Joe had stopped by the garage to check they were okay and mentioned the chance of fruit-picking work. That first day, Sheena had definitely found the guy attractive, even if he wasn't really her type. In his suit and his staid job, and she had sensed he was attracted to her too. But since then, in all the times Joe had been out to Celia's farm, he had never shown any sign of lusting after her. So she figured she had misread those initial cues. There was no mistaking the cues now. They kissed each other for a moment, but then Joe pulled back and dropped his face away again. Oh, Sheena said. Now you're thinking, this is a mistake. This'll cause problems. I mean, you're right. We shouldn't do this. You really are no good at reading thoughts. I'm thinking how incredibly soft your mouth is. They kissed again, and this time it wasn't, I wonder what it would be like to kiss you. It was, we might be about to have sex with each other. Sheena scrambled to reason with herself, but it was difficult to think rationally when she was kissing this man. Maybe it wasn't a terrible idea. She was leaving in a couple of hours, and they would never lay eyes on each other again. She wasn't wrecking his marriage, No one need ever know if they fucked each other tonight. If Rosa was correct, and she most likely was, Joe was starved for sex, so Sheena could tell herself there was a charity element. He was a lot older than her, but he was a gorgeous man, and she wanted to fuck him. Maybe it could be as simple as that. Sheena stood up, and Joe seemed uncertain if she was about to slam the door against him or invite him inside. She flicked her head to indicate he should step into the cabin. Then she shoved the esky between the end of the bunk bed and the doorway. She was almost certain Kieran would cling to every minute with Zoe until 10, the agreed time, but just in case, the esky would be an effective barricade if Kieran came back early and tried to push the door open. The moving of the esky felt like a bold move, the certain signal that she wanted this to happen. Joe shrugged off his jacket, chucked it on the top bunk, then pulled Sheena to him. There was a degree of awkwardness having sex on the single bunk bed, crowded under the top bunk. It required a fair bit of, sorry, let me just move sideways and watch your head on the rail. But Joe was decisive as he gently manoeuvred their two bodies in the limited space. And that didn't seem to diminish the intensity of the encounter, with its weird mix of politeness and lust. Joe was simultaneously the considerate man and a guy who desperately needed a fuck. Sheena knew this wasn't sex between two people because they cared about each other. Well, they probably did care about each other, but that was beside the point. He wasn't having sex with her in particular. He just needed to fuck someone. But there was tenderness and no darkness or anger in it. 10. Rosa had cooled off by lying in a tepid bath, happily allowing the house to grow dark as it filled with the milder night air. Afterwards, she did switch on a few lamps, then pulled on cotton harem pants and a matching top made from a fabric shot through with gold thread. There was rarely anyone in her house to see this sparkly and exotic ensemble, but she liked to wear it most evenings anyway. She filled her belly with a chicken, wine and vegetable concoction she had cooked because the dish was one of Joseph's favourites. She ate without him. She was hungry, and anyway, he hadn't mentioned a definite arrival time on the phone. She put the leftovers in the fridge on an elegant platter in case her son needed food when he eventually drove up. When the 9 o'clock news came on the radio, Rosa turned up the volume to hear the weather forecast. Tomorrow it would be 42 degrees, well over 100 on the old scale. After the bout of heavy rain, tomorrow's high temperature meant there was a risk an extraordinary thing could happen in the orchard. The fruit might cook on the trees. True, Rosa herself would never have believed it if she hadn't seen it with her own eyeballs one year. She put fresh sheets on the bed in the spare room for Joseph. He hadn't said why he was coming to stay the night at her house, and Rosa didn't ask, even though the question was rattling in her throat, desperate to jump out of her mouth. She hoped it was a sign that he might be reconsidering the future of his marriage, but she didn't dare set her heart on it. Better not to set up expectations that could fall short. Better to allow events to roll towards you in their own time. Then choose your moment to duck out of the way or let them slide over you. The knock on the door just after 9 was too insistent to be Joe. He would never knock in such a demanding way. "Who is that?" Rosa called from the hallway. "It's me," Celia called back. "Sorry if I gave you a fright, Rosa. Sorry." When Rosa opened the door, she saw that the woman looked as anxious as she sounded. Celia had been running across the property, the ground still soggy from the rain, so her bare shins and sandaled feet were spattered with mud, as if she'd been pulled out of wet soil like a deracinated plant. "Joe's not here yet?" Celia asked, staying outside, keeping her muddy shoes off the veranda mat. "Thing is, he should be here by now, and I'm just wanting to know where Zoe is. You haven't seen her? I checked down at the shearing shed and anyway, don't worry, She turned, flicking on the torch in her hand, and hurried away from the house. "Wait!" Rosa called after her. She hauled on the gumboots that lived on the veranda and picked up the torch hanging from a hook just inside the front door. It was a large black metal object, heavy enough for Rosa to cosh a robber over the head. That is, if her old woman arms had enough strength to cosh any robber. She headed outside after Celia. Rosa wasn't sure what was happening, but it was clear Celia needed help. She followed the beam of Celia's torch up the path to the farm and then into the orchard. Rosa was much slower on her feet than the younger woman, especially so when galumphing in gumboots. But there were chances for Rosa to close a gap when Celia stopped to look along the other pathways, the torch beam startlingly bright in the dark orchard. By the time Rosa caught up with Celia, they were almost at the cabin where the young man and his sister had been living. The gas lamp glowed golden through the front window. "Hello," Celia yelled out. "Sheena! Kieran? Have you seen Zoe?" From inside the cabin, Rosa heard the scraping sound of something heavy sliding across the floor before the door opened a little way. Sheena poked only her head out. "Hi. No, I haven't seen... Sorry, no." The young woman must have looked furtive to Celia, guilty even. Suspecting Sheena was hiding Zoe behind her in the cabin, Celia lunged forward and with one decisive thump pushed the door wide open. "Zoe, are you in there?" Sheena was revealed to be bare-legged, wearing only a t-shirt, stretching the fabric down at the front to cover herself. Behind her, Joseph was pulling his suit pants on, the rest of his clothes in a pile on the floor. He looked embarrassed, flustered, as you would well expect him to be when discovered in such a tableau. It was the kind of ludicrous scene that might ordinarily make Rosa sigh indulgently, or even laugh at the way most of us fumble around in the world, trying to grab what we hope will be chunks of happiness or pleasure. There was a bounce of surprise for Rosa that her overly considered and straight-laced son had ever found his way into another woman's bed, let alone the bunk bed of this prickly young woman. But right now was not the moment for amusement or speculation about Joseph or moral interrogation of this bunk bed farce. Celia's panic about her daughter drowned out all other concerns. "Where's Kieran?" Celia asked Sheena. "Do you know where Zoe is?" "No, sorry, no, I don't." Sheena made a "please wait" gesture and ducked into the corner of the cabin to pull some shorts on under her t-shirt. At the same time, Joseph, shirtless and barefoot, moved forward into the doorway. If Celia felt distressed or betrayed by what Joe had just done, she did not waste energy on that now. "Did you drive their car here?" she asked him. I did. Just let me check something." Celia avoided direct eye contact with him, and Joe seemed relieved not to meet her gaze. And when he jumped over the front step to the ground, she lurched backwards to stay well clear of him, not wanting him to touch her as he brushed past. Joe ran off to check this something, and at the same time, Sheena started blathering at Celia, urging her not to worry. Kieran would be back soon, and then they were definitely leaving. All his belongings were here, packed, ready to leave, as agreed. Sheena held out her palm with the car key Joe had brought, displaying it to Celia as proof they were really going. But Rosa could see Sheena recognising, in this one crumbling moment, that she had misjudged this, and that things had spun out of any control she ever imagined she had. Joe hurried back towards them, his suit trousers spattered with mud. "Sheena's car. I parked it by the gate and now it's gone." "Does Kieran have spare keys to that car?" Rosa asked. Sheena groaned. "He doesn't need any. My brother could hotwire an old car like that one in 30 seconds. She looked at the key in her palm as if that key was the problem and the reason she had been fooled. Joe handed Sheena her watch, which he'd found sitting on the gatepost. Then he turned to Celia. "Did Zoe say anything at all? Did she take any clothes or money from the house?" Celia was silent, holding a lungful of air without exhaling. She was immobile, suspended in the last fraction of time before this slammed into her. "Celia," said Joe, "listen to me. It's fine. I'm sure it'll be fine." But Celia didn't seem to hear him speaking to her. "I'll find her," she said to herself, but aloud. Then she hurried away, into the orchard. with the torch aimed ahead of her like a weapon, its yellow beam slicing through the air. Part 2. (11) One thing Rosa had never liked about Australia was a feeble excuse for seasons. In summer, grey-green leaves, and in winter, the grey-green leaves would still be stuck there on the trees. No one could call that a proper season. The year had no rhythm to swing a person through. For this reason, she had been glad to settle in a fruit-growing area. Living around stone fruit orchards, the leaves changed colour, and later, when the trees were bare, at least it looked like a winter. This winter was proving surprisingly cold, even in the first days of June. So when Rosa contemplated leaving her warm house to walk up to Celia's packing shed, she put on the alpaca sweater her son had bought back years ago from a trip to the United States. It was the lightest, softest sweater she had ever owned, yet almost inconceivably warming, as if spun from some magical substance. Joe had chosen a blood red colour for his mother, knowing her tastes well, so this was a garment she was very happy to wear once the weather was cold enough. 14 and a bit years ago, Rosa and Sandor had been living in the yellow-painted house surrounded by orchards for little more than 13 months when his body failed. The electrical circuits in his heart fried and frizzled. That was the problem with marrying a man so much older. Sander had been a wonderful husband, if you overlooked his labile moods and the teeth-sucking noises. But Rosa would never complain, because those were the kind of faults you should overlook when a man was as thoughtful, amusing, and honourable as Sandor, and as generous and skilled a lover. They had been a blessed pair, no question. For many years she had adored him, and he had adored her, each conscious they had rescued the other from the miserable lives into which they could easily have stumbled. After Sandor died, Rosa had one consoling idea in her head. Now, apart from Joseph, of course, she just had herself to worry about. She could suit herself. She could eat sardines followed by chocolate mousse every night if she fancied. But the truth was, she did not eat a lot of mousse. She drank vodka, because the consoling idea was not so consoling. The vodka was much more effective. It was a couple of years after Sandor died when Celia said, "Rosa, I need help with packing the fruit." Rosa knew this was a plan that Celia and Joseph had cooked up to get her out of the house and busy. But it turned out she was bloody good at the job. After that, for the next 10 years, it went like this. Summer and autumn, Rosa would be up at 5 to work for Celia, sober. Winter, she could retreat to her little underworld with vodka and silly television shows to keep her company. Celia would stroll down to check on her sometimes, but she eventually gave up on inviting Rosa for meals in the winter. She let her be, accepting the sozzled hibernation was the choice her neighbour had made. This winter was different. Any person observing Rosa walk into the yard of the packing shed in her red alpaca sweater would see she was completely sober. She had to keep herself clear-headed because there were people who might need her help. In the first days after Zoe had disappeared, Celia had stayed mostly in the house, making phone calls, contacting the girls' friends, waiting for messages that might come, hoping her daughter would simply return home. During this time, the remaining peaches and nectarines were left to rot on the trees or fall to the ground and rot there. In the heat, thousands of dollars worth of fruit cooked down into a worthless, nasty jam spread across the mulch. The smell was potent, a sticky sweet substance clinging to the nostrils and the lining of the lungs. Apart from money being lost in the pulpy mess, Rosa worried that the putrefying fruit might cause problems with fungus and crawling beasts. But Celia would not listen to anyone who suggested she bring in some help. She couldn't give her mind to such matters. The only thing she cared about was her daughter, of course. Celia stayed close to home for 2 weeks after Zoe left, until one morning she abruptly left the property without telling anyone. That was over 4 months ago now. Rosa had tried to keep the vegetable plot going, tramping up the slope every day to water and weed and flick off any bugs eating the foliage. But it proved too much to manage. Eventually, Jo dug the remnants of the vegetable plants back into the soil, so they could at least be of use as compost in the garden beds. Since then, Rosa had persisted with a daily walk up to the farm, taking the longer route, via the front gate, to check Celia's mailbox. She would then make a slow circuit around the packing shed and the house. This way she could check if there had been any damage done by wind or robbers or creatures overnight, and it was also a way to keep her ancient limbs awake and mobile. Rosa had always had a key to Celia's place, but these days she used it for a special task. With Celia gone away on her search, there was no one to hear a phone ring in the empty house or the idle packing shed. And so Joseph had connected a telephone answering machine to Celia's home line. He had originally bought this machine for his office in town, but his secretary would not touch the thing for fear she might break it, or the device would leap up off the desk to tear out her throat. Rosa was not afraid of the machine, installed on Celia's kitchen counter in its fake wood laminate casing. In appearance and operation, it was much like a cassette player. So not an object any sensible person would regard as monstrous. In fact, Rosa respected and admired the contraption. It had the power to capture messages that could otherwise be lost. Of course, there was a risk it was storing distressing messages in its metal and plastic innards, but that was not the machine's fault. And it was always better to know. Every morning, Rosa let herself in through Celia's kitchen door and checked the tiny red bulb on the front of the device. If the light was flashing, she set out notepaper and pencil before hitting the playback tab, ready to write down messages from the police or anyone with information she must relay to Celia. Before hitting the button, Rosa also readied her own body, taking a big breath and bracing her rib cage, in case a voice coming out of the machine were to deliver bad news about Zoe. The first weeks, the tape was filled with confused voices stammering their way out of the little holes in the speaker. Sorry, have I got the right number? Is this, People were flummoxed, unused to speaking to an answering machine. Celia, you there? Is this thing recording me or am I supposed to, I'll ring back later. Sometimes there would just be the fragile sound of a person breathing, barely audible through the swish of the tape between the tiny rollers. Rosa fancied she could hear the person's brain clunking around as they tried to work out what to say. There was also the hope that the flashing bulb heralded good news or even the voice of the girl herself, saying she was okay, saying she was coming home. Maybe some of the breathing noises on the tape had been Zoe, but Rosa doubted that. She believed she would somehow divine if it had been Zoe breathing, hesitating, letting the tape hiss on. There had been almost no useful dispatches on the machine, a few possible sightings of the girl, but all proved to be dead ends. Some friends and neighbours had recorded their concern for Celia, words tight in their throats, tight with worry, or the inadequacy of words. In some cases, there was a tinge of unspoken smugness. My child has not run off. Rosa was happy to filter these messages for Celia. People's best wishes were so often bound up with their own fears or vanities or self-absorbed notions about the way things went in the world. It was better if Rosa was simply able to say to Celia, Mrs. So-and-so is thinking of you. Santino sends his love, and the lady from the PNC offers any help she can give. This particular day, the red light was not flashing. No messages. In fact, there had been no messages for over a week now. Rosa had finished her checklist, letterbox, garden, house, answering machine, and was coming back towards a packing shed when Jo drove into the yard. He climbed out of the vehicle and gave his mother a kiss. Thought you might be prowling around up here, Mum. I just dropped off some bags on your front veranda. What bags? Bags of what? Rosa asked. We're sorting through some stuff at our place. There were some things Heather thought you might be able to use. Rosa snorted. Are these things items of overpriced foolish junk Heather bought and now throws out so she can buy new? Basically, yes. Will they be useful to me? No. Except as a physical reminder of your contempt for Heather, said Joe with a small smile. Even though he was always patient with his mother, there were times Rosa could hear the scrape of irritation in his voice. But other times, right now being an example, he appeared to enjoy the game, at least a little. Well, so please drop the bags at the Salvation Army in town, said Rosa. Then without warning, she grabbed his head with her hands in order to examine his eyeballs. Joseph, what's going on? About what? You tell me about what? Joe shrugged. Heather asked me to move out. Ah, is this for permanent? Yes, it's permanent. You didn't have to confess to the sex, Rosa pointed out. It's only that one intercourse months ago we're talking about, isn't it? He nodded. The woman, Sheena, she wouldn't have told. Celia has gone away. I would never tell, so why? I felt I had no choice. Her son, the honourable man. Joseph had admitted to the infidelity to his wife the very next day after the act. But it took him some weeks to summon the courage to confess to his mother that he had confessed to his wife. Rosa waggled her head. So? Heather has been marching you to the marriage counselling for months? Now suddenly she decides to throw you out like the garbage? The decision was mutual in many ways, said Joe, in the calm voice he used sometimes, as if his mother were a crazy woman to be handled. I always knew this is what she would do in the end, as you made very clear. Rosa was relieved to hear that miserable marriage was over, but even so, it annoyed her to see Heather tormenting Joseph without a tiny shred of goodwill in her heart. Before she kicked you out, she wanted her months of watching you ride with the guilt first. Joe closed his eyes and sighed, Mum, please don't. I keep my mouth shut. And indeed, Rosa's mouth did stay shut for several seconds before a question snuck its way out. You're not still having some kind of relations with Sheena, are you? What? No, I'm not. Zoe and Kieran had run away together using the sisters' car, leaving Sheena stranded on the farm. Desperate to transport herself far away as rapidly as possible, she arranged a lift into Narralong with a neighbour. Before she left, the sister gave Celia a piece of paper that might help in the search for the girl. She also insisted on handing back the envelope of cash. She was not a charming person, that Sheena, but she was a person of honour. Rosa was convinced Joseph's intercourse with the sister had been an unplanned business, foolish or selfish, or a blessing, depending on a person's point of view. And she didn't believe it made any difference to the outcome of that night. The young couple would have run off together whether Joseph and Sheena had kept on their underwear or not. That hour of sexual activity had other consequences, of course, precipitating the end of his marriage and brewing up a painful awkwardness between Celia and Joe. Rosa watched her beautiful son wander around the bare, chilly yard. He looked so reduced by the last months. She would have donated him some of her energy if that were possible. At the very least, she wanted to coddle and restore him, to shower him with affection and food and admiration and her boundless love. But seeing no means to do that right now, instead she said, Well, Joseph, since you've been sufficiently tormented by your wife that she now decides to dismiss you, where will you live? I've got a room at a motel near the office, just until I find somewhere long-term. You are always welcome to live with me, or you could go off on a trip somewhere in the world. Now that you're a single man again, have some fun. Joseph looked at her pointedly. Of course, said Rosa. You don't want to be far from the children. Of course I don't. There were men who could spend time away from their children with no great suffering, but Joseph was not one of them. It was strange for Rosa to find herself half wishing her son was a less deep-feeling man, more petty and selfish. But of course she was glad he was a devoted father. Even so, it was hard to see things tearing at his insides. Joe looked out from the yard towards a row of bare fruit trees, with their straggly, unpruned branches and the ground invaded by weeds. The orchard's a mess. Rosa flicked her hands in the air. More than 4 months abandoned. It's a problem if the trees are left like this too long, isn't it? This is why the ginger boy and his cousin should come and do the urgent work. I could organize that for Celia. Rosa shrugged. I suggested this. Joe had done his best for Celia, calling on contacts who might help in the search for Zoe and taking care of any farm business it was possible for him to do. Rosa knew he fretted about whether he should telephone Celia. She might not appreciate a call from him on account of the intercourse with the boy's sister. So he didn't call her. Instead, he relied on Rosa for news about Celia's well-being. Rosa could see her son's pudgy belly had been whittled away in the last months. This was a welcome outcome in itself, much like the end of his marriage. But, like the end of his marriage, it was sad to see the unhappiness that went along with it. You're not eating, Rosa said. Stay for lunch. I can't. I have to go to Hamish's athletics carnival. Ah, yes. Well, let me parcel up some food to take back to your sad little motel room of shame. Joseph automatically responded, No thanks. But a second later, he flashed her that small smile. You know what? That'd be lovely, Mum. Thanks. Rosa allowed her son to drive her back to her house, and together they sorted through the bag of Heather's cast-offs on the veranda. They salvaged a few items, including expensive double-bed sheets still in their packaging. Heather had no use for them since she had recently purchased a queen-size bed. Maybe the larger bed was more convenient for avoiding sex. Well, now she was discarding her husband, so that unnecessarily huge bed would have been even more wasted. While Joe stowed the rest of the bags back in the boot of his car, Rosa ducked inside to spoon a big serving of food to a plastic container for her son to take back into town. That evening, Rosa ate the portion left over. She had just settled down to watch one of her television shows. This one featured a man with bionic body parts when Celia phoned. The conversation went the way it always did. Hello, Rosa. It's me. Any news? She meant news about Zoe, nothing else. Soaked into every word Celia spoke was the question, Has Zoe come home? But she couldn't risk asking that question out loud for fear the hope for a yes and the disappointment of the no would be more than her body could stand. So Celia asked practical questions about mail and phone messages. Every time she rang, every time, it broke Rosa's heart. No, she would have to say to Celia, no messages or letters. Oh, Celia replied, as she always did. Then the poor woman would gather herself up again and read out the phone number of the motel where she would be staying for the next few days, so Rosa could write it down. You can contact me here until at least Wednesday. The phone calls always ended this way. Are you okay, Rosa? I'm okay. And you? The same. Stay well. Celia would say and then quickly hang up. When Rosa put down the phone, and hours later, lying in bed, Celia would still be in her thoughts, whether Rosa liked it or not. It was easy for the mind to tune into the waves of suffering going on around the world at any moment in time. It was like owning a stupid, malfunctioning radio that could only pick up wretched frequencies, and that would somehow record and gather up all the miseries of the past, the cries of every childless mother, every anguished individual Rosa had ever known, and transmit them into her head. An old lady lying in her bed, stewing on such things. What good would that do Celia or Joseph or anyone? None. To fight off this tendency in her brain, Rosa had always tried very hard to tune into the joyful things that must surely be going on at this instant somewhere in the world. But these days, such mental discipline was more difficult. So she was at the mercy of the waves of sorrowful thoughts. This was where the vodka would have come in handy. 12. Celia opened her eyes, and for a few seconds was disoriented, needing to hook her gaze onto the position of the window, the light fitting and the furniture around her to locate herself on the earth's surface. Here she was in another budget motel room, with her suitcase flipped open on the luggage stand and her truck parked just outside the door. Every morning, the shock of it hit her fresh. Her daughter was missing. It was the same when Marcus was killed. This waking up to be clobbered by the hard fact of it again, followed by the surprise of finding that her body was, unbelievably, continuing to function. Blood and nerves and complex cellular physiology humming along as if nothing had changed. The daily shock of losing Marcus had been superseded by a more benign mechanism when Zoe was born, which had allowed her to persevere and then settle and then to live with some joy. Now, with Zoe lost, the first thing Celia did every morning, wherever she found herself, was reach for the telephone handset beside the bed, checking for a dial tone. She worried that during the 3 or 4 hours of sleep she had managed through the night, she may have accidentally knocked the receiver out of its cradle and so missed an important message. But this morning, there was a strong purr of a dial tone, as there always was. The room was much like every other motel room she'd been in. There was a television set bolted near the top of the bare brick wall, raspy carpet tiles pocked with cigarette burns, and a dark timber cupboard so battered it looked as if someone had kicked it around the bitumen car park. The bedspread was mustard-coloured, quilted nylon with crusty patches, each one the dried remnants of tears or snot or semen of a previous guest. Cigarette smoke had saturated every surface, even the brickwork, and Celia's hair stank of fags just from sleeping in the room. Dispiriting as the joint was, Celia worried about the expensive motels, even the rank ones. She considered staying in cheap pubs. If you hunted around, you could find a single for $15 a night, but pub accommodation didn't have telephones in the rooms. Celia knew she would never get any sleep at all if there wasn't a phone on the bedside table, a means for Rosa or the police to reach her. She opted for the cheapest motels she could find, but after so many nights it was adding up to a lot of cash. If that meant chewing through money, sucking up more and more through the line of credit on the property, then that was how it had to be. Celia launched out of bed and into the shower to blast herself more usefully awake. Over the past few months, she had conducted each searching day as if she held a job with an urgent deadline. It made no sense, but it was one of the ways to funnel the anxiety and keep going. When Zoe first disappeared, Celia had lodged a missing person report at the Narralong police station. The sergeant, Noel, was kind in a slightly patronising way, but unquestionably kind. As he filled out the official paperwork, the biro clamped in his meaty paw, he related stories about the many teenage runaway cases he'd encountered over the years. A dozen girls who had run off but returned home safely a few days later. His tone was steady, relentlessly calm, intended to reassure. Celia was hungry for any reassurance on offer, but as she listened to the police sergeant talk about those other runaways in his avuncular sing-song, she couldn't take any comfort. If anything, Noel's stories had the effect of slapping her with the realisation that Zoe wasn't some capricious teen having a tantrum. This was something different. Those first 2 weeks, Celia had stayed on the farm, never moving out of earshot of the phone. If she ever ventured from the house, it was only as far as the packing shed, where the ringer on the telephone extension was good and loud. She prowled the yard, never letting her eyes drift away from the driveway for more than half a minute, as if the fixedness of her gaze could conjure a vehicle to appear and deliver her daughter home. Then, in early February, a postcard arrived, with a photograph of the kangaroo on the front, and on the back, in Zoe's handwriting, the words, "Don't worry." The postmark was smudgy, but could well have said Leighton. Celia took the kangaroo postcard as code that Zoe did not intend to show up at home anytime soon. The missing person file would bump along through the system and police would do what they could, she assumed. But Celia knew she was the one charged with finding her daughter. That was when she left the property and set out to search. She tried to be logical about it, mapping routes between towns where Zoe had school friends, but also keeping in mind the timetable of the harvest circuit. Zoe and Kieran needed money, but would want to keep moving, so picking work made sense. Celia developed a routine. When she reached each new town, she would check in with the local police, then do rounds of the pubs and milk bars, asking questions, showing a photo of Zoe. The only useful pictures she had was a snapshot taken in a cafe on Zoe's last birthday, slightly out of focus. The other option was a school portrait photo, her daughter with plaited hair and a dutiful smile, stiffly posed against the mottled blue backdrop. Zoe had never really looked like that portrait girl, and she surely looked even less like that unworldly teenager now. Celia would then drive around to any properties in the district that hired casual pickers, talking to the farmers. The minute she said her daughter was 16 and missing, the farmers would generally be helpful. They were no nonsense about it, without the sort of fuss that comes dripping in pity. Their straightforward manner suited Celia, because a direct hit of sympathy might well have cracked her apart. She would leave each farmer a copy of the photo with her home phone number written on the back in case Zoe turned up after Celia had gone. At the beginning of March, there was a bloke, a grape grower, who recognised the photo. According to the guy, Zoe and Kieran had stopped by looking for work, but the place already had its full team of pickers. The grower remembered them because the two kids had been smiling for no good reason he could decipher and had been all over each other like a rash. Celia quizzed the man. What exactly had the two kids said? How did they seem? Did they say where they were headed next? The grower tightened up his face against the battery of questions, but he didn't take offence. He could see she was in a desperate state of mind. He was sorry he couldn't offer anything more in the way of useful information. Through March and into April, Celia had persevered, gripping on to that one sighting and any other mention of a young couple that could have been them, or a car that could have been Sheena's old bomb. She followed the routes she guessed Zoe would have taken, chasing after the seasons, the stone fruit, the grapes, the apples. Easter fell in the second week of April. Months back, before school broke up for the summer holidays, Zoe had been invited to spend the Easter break with her friend Mandy, whose family kept a caravan by the beach at Kiama. Celia had said yes immediately, but she had also immediately calculated the risks involved in Zoe travelling in the Mickaloons' car from their house in Everett's Bridge all the way to the coast. The chance of her being swept away by a strong rip. She'd done so little ocean swimming. The odds of the symptoms of a sudden onset illness going unnoticed by people who didn't know her daughter well. As always, she conducted this protective voodoo without saying anything to Zoe. Celia's enthusiastic, "Yes, of course you can go, how wonderful," was genuine. She loved the idea of her daughter having a beach holiday with her friend. That was why she had given Zoe the beach towel and beach bag for Christmas. The phone calls to arrange that trip seemed inconceivably long ago now. Mandy was the first of the friends Celia had called when Zoe disappeared. The girl insisted she hadn't spoken to Zoe since school had broken up the previous December and had no idea where she was now. Celia had believed her, if only because Mandy sounded so miffed about being neglected by her supposed best friend. Later, on the Saturday of the Easter break, Celia replayed in her mind that phone call with Mandy, questioning her own ability to detect dishonesty in the voice of a 16-year-old girl. Mandy might have been hiding something. People could lie much more fluently on the phone. Face-to-face, it was harder to lie and easier to read a lie. Once that doubt took hold, Celia had immediately checked out of the Batlow Motel where she had slept the night. She drove out of the town, away from the apple orchards, across to the coast, then north to Kiama. She drove too fast and she drove for hours, only ever stopping to fill up the tank or buy food she could eat at the wheel. It was absurd. A few days would make no difference, but she couldn't suppress the urge to rush. She reached the caravan park in the early evening, obeying the signs to slow down along the road that ran through the grassy area set aside for campers, with little alcoves carved out of the coastal shrubs for people to pitch their tents. The camping ground was thrumming with activity. It was the time of the day when dinners were being prepared, and children were being hustled to showers and filled with a burble of noise from pop songs on transistor radios, the clattering of cooking implements, toddlers squealing as parents chivied them along. Half a dozen kids were playing cricket with one of the fathers on the open patch of grass. A mother herded her twin girls, maybe 5 years old. Back from the ablution block, in their matching terry toweling ponchos. A cluster of grown-ups stood around a barbecue, cans of beer in hand, laughing and blustery. People turned their heads to stare at Celia, curious, not hostile. A farm ute, driven by a solitary woman, was incongruous here. She kept weaving through the place until she found the section with the semi-permanent caravans, where she spotted Keith McAloon's electrician truck parked alongside one of the vans. The van was set up for years of holidays, chocked in place on a concrete pad, hooked up to a power socket, bordered by succulent plants in pots painted bright blue. A striped annex was attached to the side, and under its large awning, there was room for a table and chairs. "Ah, hi," said Elaine McAloon as Celia approached her. The two mothers had met at the end-of-year school concert and spoken several times on the phone. "Hi, Elaine." "Keith," Elaine called out to her husband, who was turning sausages on the barbecue on the other side of the gravel roadway. "Keith, it's Celia, Zoe's mum." Celia saw the glance flicked between the two of them. The gossip mechanisms had done their work. They both knew she was the mother whose daughter had run away with a young man wanted by the police. Keith trotted over to the caravan, tongs in hand. He smiled hello, but then exchanged another look with his wife, both unsure what to say. Celia jumped in to save them from their awkwardness. "Listen, I'm sorry to just turn up like this." "Here she is," said Keith, pointing his tongs towards someone on the beach path. Celia's chest lurched for one brief, excruciatingly hopeful moment. Then she looked around to see it was Mandy running up the path, holding a blow-up surfing mat on her head. "Ah, hello, Mrs. Jansen." Mandy was straight out of the surf, her ruffled orange swimming costume still wet, shins crusted with sand, hair a salty clump, nose peeling from sunburn on top of sunburn. Celia moved towards her. "Mandy, where is she?" "Do you know?" "Beg yours?" the girl responded. She was flustered, looking caught out, guilty. "You have to be honest with me. Have you talked to her? Has she told you where she is?" "No, sorry. I haven't talked to Zoe at all Has she sent you letters? Has she made you promise not to tell anyone? Is that what's going on?" "No, dead set, Mrs. Jansen. I haven't even—" "You must tell me the truth, Mandy." "Look, I think Mandy's made it clear she hasn't heard anything," said Keith, his composed adult tone forcing Celia to hear the hectoring pitch in her own voice. She had ended up moving intimidatingly close to Mandy, skewering the girl with her gaze. And by this point, the McAloon boys, 8 and 10 years old, had also scooted up from the beach. The two little brothers froze, registering the tension in front of them, and glanced to their mother for explanation. Keith shifted himself in between Celia and his daughter, a shielding move. But shielding Celia as much as Mandy, protecting this poor distressed woman from doing something foolish. "Celia, how about you come over and sit down," he said. His wife chimed in with an equally mollifying tone. "Stay and have some dinner with us. There's plenty." Elaine indicated the table where she was preparing food. A bowl of salad, a platter of waxy cheese slices, bread and margarine, tomato sauce, all waiting for the sausages. Elaine McAloon was in the process of arranging vegetables into faces on plates for the two younger kids. Shredded lettuce hair, cucumber slice eyes with grated carrot eyebrows, tomato cheeks, and half a slice of tinned beetroot as a mouth. Celia swiveled back to see that Mandy was fidgety, with the embarrassed grin of an adolescent who has no idea how to be at that moment. She suddenly struck Celia as so young. The panic she had seen on Mandy's face was not guilt about lying. The girl had been nervous because she was just a kid afraid of Celia's ferocious questions. "I'm so sorry, Mandy. Please forgive me." That's. The girl didn't know how to respond and kept silently appealing to her parents. "What do I do now?" "Please, Celia, stay and eat with us," urged Elaine. "We've all been worried about Zoe, but good Lord, you must be—" "No," Celia said too abruptly, then quickly modulated her tone. "Thank you. No, I should go. I'm sorry for barging in on your holiday. I'm sorry." Celia was already hurrying to the door of her ute, desperate to escape the pitying looks from these people, from their uncomprehending kindness. Keith called after her. "We'll let you know if you hear anything. If Zoe gets in touch with Mandy, we'll call you quick smart. That's a promise." Celia nodded her thanks through the windscreen, then swung the ute around and away. She drove out of the camping ground and picked up speed on the main road. She drove non-stop until the light had completely gone from the day. She wasn't heading anywhere in particular, other than far away from her own appalling behaviour. Once it was dark enough, she felt a little more comfortable, her shame unseen now that she'd sunk into the night. At the next crossroads, there were signs to Sydney, and she pointed the vehicle that way. There was no future in trailing around the picking circuit any longer. Celia guessed all she could do was guess that Zoe would have headed for the city by now. The first thing Celia did in Sydney was hire a private investigator, a guy she found in the Yellow Pages, and give him all the information she had. She suspected he was ripping her off, but she would do whatever might have some chance of working. Several good-hearted friends had repeatedly offered Celia a place to stay in Sydney. It would make sense financially, but as a guest in a friend's spare room, she would be obliged, after some period of indulgence and sympathy, to behave normally. And she would be obliged to talk about what had happened. So she made excuses to decline the invitations. The hardest person to turn down was Freya, her husband's sister. There had always been a strong friendship between Celia and her sister-in-law, which had intensified when Marcus was killed. But that was the problem. Freya's eyes would be on her, and there would be questions whirring in the air, even if little was said. So Celia decided it was best to stick with motels. This is in the outer suburbs of the city, where the rooms were cheaper. As April rolled into May and now June, the bank manager in Narralong expressed concern about the growing overdraft on the farm account, and Celia was required to call him on several occasions. She found that there was a voice she could use. This was more easily achieved on the phone, a steely tone but with a hint of crazy glinting off the edge, which when coupled with some mention of my missing daughter, managed to shut someone up. However misguided people thought she was, they would step aside and let her continue on. It was an unworthy manoeuvre. That voice, cheap emotional blackmail really, but it achieved what Celia needed to keep going without wasting time. When the weather turned cold, she bought a knee-length sheepskin coat from the Salvation Army op shop. This wasn't about comfort. If anything, she felt a penitential urge to endure physical discomfort. But wearing that coat allowed Celia to stay outdoors for long periods of time. She was following up addresses Sheena had given her, places Kieran had lived or liked to hang out, and sometimes stationed herself outside a certain house or pub, hoping for a sighting of Zoe or the boy. Thanks to that warm coat, she could sit and wait for hours and hours. 13. Sheena's fingers were black up to the second joint from counting banknotes into bundles and rolling piles of coins into the paper wrappers. She would have to scrub her hands with washing up liquid to be rid of the money grime, then slather on moisturiser so she didn't end up with dermatitis again. After a busy Friday night, La Parisienne finally closed at 4 a.m, but Sheena had to stay back to clear the tills and lock up. In a narrow street off the main drag of Surfers Paradise, La Parisienne declared itself to be a nightclub, but was just a bar really, seeing as there was no dance floor. The decor was red and black, with one wall sporting a shithouse mural that optimistically claimed to be a silhouette of the Paris skyline, and in the foreground featured the outline of a French hooker with a disproportionately big head and one stilettoed foot up in the air at a supposedly saucy angle. The lighting was kept dim, with red bulbs and fringed scarlet lampshades, so in the low light the place didn't look too terrible to the customers, especially through the added filter of numerous Bundy and Cokes. But now, with the fluorescent lights on and the chairs up on tables ready for the cleaners, the shabbiness was on display. Every surface was scuffed or gouged, the velvet upholstery on the booths saggy and tatty. By the end of the night, and before the cleaners arrived, the floor was as grotty as you'd expect, with spilled drinks dried into sticky blotches that attracted a garnish of fluff, scraps of paper, human hair and cigarette butts. To go with the chic French decor, female staff wore a uniform supplied by the management, a red off-the-shoulder peasant blouse with an elasticized neckline, a black miniskirt and fishnet stockings. As Sheena counted the money at the end of each night, she always sat with her back to the Parisian mural because in the merciless white glare of the fluoros, there was something truly depressing about that abysmal painting, sad beyond any joke Sheena could construct in her mind. Sheena had left Celia's place the day after the huge mess. She didn't want to hang around Sydney, so she headed for Surfers Paradise, figuring she'd find work there. In fact, she'd secured a trial shift as a barmaid at La Parisienne the first afternoon she asked around. Within days, she was on the full-time roster, mostly because Rudenko, the owner, liked the fact that the other bar staff, all the young women, were scared of Sheena and therefore less likely to fiddle the till when her eyes were on them. Within weeks, she was promoted to night manageress, probably because she was the only staff member with 2 neurons to rub together and smart enough to know that it would be unwise to skim money off a guy like Rudenko. Sheena might rejoice in the exalted title of night manageress, but the pay was shit and Rudenko still expected her to wear the same slutty outfit as the rest of the staff. So, as she sat counting the night's takings, she could feel the abrasive mesh of the fishnets waffling her thighs against the chair and the nylon of the peasant blouse scratching wherever it touched her skin. Rudenko was in his 50s, dark-eyed and bulky, one of those men whose neck was as wide as his skull, so his head just sort of merged with his shoulders. He had propositioned Sheena the 3rd night she worked there, blessedly doing so in a direct, verbal way rather than by groping her. He simply said, "Sheena, would you like to become my mistress?" When she said, "No, thanks," he just shrugged and accepted her polite, equally direct refusal. She had worried that the boss might become a nuisance, sniffing around her, but he seemed philosophical about the knockback. When he entertained business associates in the back booth, Rudenko ran construction businesses and other ventures Sheena knew better than to be curious about. He insisted Sheena serve their table. She would pour the libre fromage and bring over platters of oysters Kilpatrick from the seafood place around the corner. The boss also liked the way she could pour cream into their glasses of Tia Maria, so a layer of white sat on top of the syrupy brown liqueur. Whenever she came over to their table, Rudenko would slip his chunky arm around Sheena's waist and smile seductively, giving his associates the impression she was indeed his mistress. It was no problem for Sheena to allow that impression to stand, especially if it meant keeping her job without actually having to sleep with the guy. And anyway, Rudenko wasn't the worst boss she'd ever had. He paid the lousy wages promptly, and he kept the bouncer on shift during the clean-up after closing time, so Sheena felt safe on the premises in the early hours of the morning. Not every boss would have done that. La Parisienne was the kind of place where female patrons were handed a voucher for 2 free drinks when they walked in. The bar offered a cheap price on jugs of slimy Maria, milk mixed with Tia Maria, and fruit tingle, a lurid cocktail that really did taste like the lollies. With that discount supply of infantile drinks, patrons could get themselves seriously pissed at great speed. It attracted a lot of underage girls, especially in the school holidays. The bouncer on the door didn't notice. He was a nice enough islander guy, but dumb as a box of rocks. The police didn't give a flying fuck if there were minors drinking there. They were too busy counting the cash in the paper bags Rudenko and other proprietors handed over on a regular basis. If a girl came in who looked 15, Sheena would assess if she was the kind of kid who could take care of herself. If she was a naive little twerp likely to get herself silly drunk and then pregnant or, worse, acquire herpes from one of the losers in the bar, Sheena would swing her intimidating gaze onto the poppet. "How old are you, princess?" If the teenager then blanched and stammered and scurried away from the bar, well, that decided it. Sheena had probably saved the girl from getting herself into a mess. But if some chick pouted her strawberry lipped gloss mouth, poked her padded bra defiantly through her tank top and claimed to be 18, Sheena would shrug and let it go. Those sharp-elbowed little moles could look after themselves. The worst thing about the job was being awake all night and attempting to sleep in the day. Night work messed with her body, making her feel unhealthy and slightly dirty all the time, even though she showered twice a day. The uniform contributed to the dirty sensation. The cheap nylon fabric didn't breathe at all, so Sheena was trapped in there with her own sour sweat, no matter how much deodorant she sprayed on beforehand. Then again, it might have been Surfer's Paradise itself that felt unhygienic to her. She'd forgotten how much she hated the place. It was as ugly as sin and harboured more assholes per square yard than anywhere she'd ever lived. But there was always work to be had on the Gold Coast for someone like Sheena, and the streets were full of people day or night, constantly generating noise you could disappear into. Sometimes that was an advantage. On the bus trip up to Queensland, Sheena had imagined throwing her body into the surf. It would be good to live near the beach again. But in fact, she hadn't taken herself to the beach once in the 4 months she'd been here. When the La Parisienne money was counted, packed and locked away in the safe, the registers had balanced tonight. Thank Christ. Sheena wriggled out of the miniskirt and pulled on tracksuit pants. It was cold walking through the streets at 5 a.m. in June. More importantly, she didn't want any smart-mouthed dickheads gawping at her legs in the fishnets. There was still more than an hour before sunrise, but it was never properly dark in the centre of Surfers. Street lamps, neon signs and car headlights combined to pour a thin slurry of light over the buildings. Every morning, heading back to the flat at the end of her work shift, Sheena would be reminded that this was the time of day she used to start work at Celia's place. The night Kieran and Zoe shot through, there had been an initial burst of activity. Phone calls, torchlight searches of the property, Celia driving up roads in several possible directions, more phone calls. There was fuck all chance of finding the kids that night, but everyone, including the old Hungarian lady, went along with the futile effort so they could hurl their feelings into some busy action. Just hours before, Joe and Sheena had been fucking, but for the rest of that night, while helping with the search, they didn't even make eye contact. Okay. Getting sprung in a pants-down pantomime like something out of a Benny Hill sketch would not have been a highlight in Joe's life, but the man's discomfort was deeper than simple embarrassment. Sheena wondered if he had the secret hots for Celia and now reckoned he'd blown his chance. Or maybe he was ashamed to be caught rooting a slag like Sheena and worried his upright friend Celia would think less of him. There was an acidic silence going on between Celia and Joe, no question. Maybe she was angry because his negligence, being sexually distracted at a crucial moment, had contributed to Zoe slipping away. Or she was annoyed because Joe was the dimwit who'd brought Kieran there in the first place. Possibly, Celia held a candle for Joe, so now she felt jealous. Or she'd simply lost respect for him because he'd chosen to have sex with Sheena. Whatever. There wasn't a lot of goodwill towards Sheena in any of the possible tunes playing under that muffled anger. Celia was sharp when she quizzed Sheena. What did you say to Kieran? What did he say to you? What were the words you used, your exact words? Even though Celia sounded stern, she couldn't bring herself to meet Sheena's gaze because it was obvious both of them had stuffed this up. Sheena had been an idiot to go along with the plan. But it had been the mother's idea to offer the bribe in the first place. Anyway, the kids would probably have run off together no matter what anybody had done or said. The sting for Sheena was that Kieran and Zoe had driven away believing they'd been betrayed by the people who were supposed to want the best for them. Sheena didn't like knowing that was what they would have been thinking. Then again, bugger them, and bugger Kieran especially. She'd turned herself inside fucking out to save him from his mistakes, and now he'd thrown that back in her face? That's it, Sheena had said out loud as she shoved Kieran's clothes into the 44-gallon drum Celia used as an incinerator for rubbish. She wouldn't waste one more scrap of energy caring what her brother did or what he thought. She just wanted the car back, but she wouldn't hold her breath that would ever happen. Sheena had been keen to get away from the farm, but she was stranded on account of Kieran stealing her car. Joe didn't have his vehicle on the property either, and there was no way Sheena was going to ask Celia for a lift. Eventually, Rosa suggested a solution. One of the growers down the road had a truck due to take peaches to market. Sheena could catch a lift on the truck into Narralong. Before she left, Sheena divided up the cash Celia had given her. She calculated the amount she and Kieran were legitimately owed for the picking work, and then subtracted the money Celia had spent paying for the car. That left Sheena with a few $100, enough to get back to the city and survive until she found work. The rest of the money she handed back. She didn't want someone like Celia going around saying she was a cheat. She wrote out a page of the names and likely addresses of Kieran's mates she could remember, any info that might help Celia find her daughter. Not that Sheena reckoned it would come to that. She was sure the girl would get a fright soon enough and scurry home to her mother. Sheena bought a bus ticket from Narralong to Sydney and then headed to Queensland. When she arrived up in Surfers Paradise, a woman she knew, an acquaintance really, mentioned there was a room available in her flat. The bedroom was laughably small, and the whole building stank of rancid cooking fat from the takeaway place on the ground floor. But the previous flatmate had left behind a mattress Sheena could use, and the place was better than nothing. 2 weeks ago, Sheena had walked in the front door to find Murray, aka the Dickless Wonder, ensconced on the couch. He was mates with the guy who lived in the front room, and the two of them were putting in a productive evening of bong smoking. "Sheena," Murray had said when he first saw her. "Hey, have sex with me." Astonishingly, the Wonder was still single. Murray became a frequent visitor, often hanging around the flat. Now he was back living in Surfers. Every time he saw Sheena, he would repeat the request, "Have sex with me." This particular morning, Sheena dragged her carcass in the front door to find the Dickless Wonder sprawled on the couch unconscious. She tried to slip quietly past him to the bathroom, but even at 5:30 a.m, his groin could detect the presence of a female and rouse him from sleep. "Sheena, hey, have..." She slammed her hand in the air, "Don't bother," and he obediently shut up. But then, she must have been in a weakened state. She flicked her head for him to follow her into the bedroom.
This is the end of CD 4. The book continues on CD 5.
Chances were they perceived far more than she'd imagined, and the two of them were watching her as she floundered along, observing with clear eyes, calling out to her from the shore, even if she hadn't heard them. She would love the chance now to ask them how that time had seemed to them. But before she'd ever understood enough to form those questions, they were both dead. Her mother from cancer, her father a heart attack. There was affection and mutual devotion during the periods of sickness and grief, but never any suggestion that her parents would tell their daughter how it felt to be dying, how it felt to lose a spouse. She wished now she had asked them 100 questions. She wanted to ask Zoe 1,000 questions, but she was willing to ask nothing, content not to utter a word, whatever Zoe wanted, as long as she could know she was alive. At each post, on her searching rounds, Celia would find an unobtrusive spot to sit, in the hope that Zoe might wander past. She was convinced she would be able to pick her daughter out in a crowd of people, instantly recognise some gesture, the shape of her shoulders, the way she carried her head. Her child was so known to her, embedded in the tissues of her body, that she would identify her from the tiniest glimpse. In the nightly phone calls to Rosa, Celia didn't mention her searching routine for fear it would sound deranged. And for her part, Rosa tried not to sound too worried about Celia's mental state. Rosa would often pass on messages from Joe, well, always the same message. "Joe says to please tell him if there's anything he can do to help." Celia tried to avoid thinking about Joe. At first she'd been angry with him. He'd been too busy bonking Sheena to notice Zoe being spirited away by the boy. Later, once her head had stopped spinning, Celia accepted that was nonsense. Joe and Sheena's sexual encounter had made no difference to the outcome, but it had left Celia feeling foolish. She must have been so thick not to have noticed Joe's attraction to the woman, and she felt slighted that in all these years he'd never made a pass at her. Celia always assumed he was so staunchly faithful to Heather that he would never consider straying, but he strayed with Sheena without too much persuasion. Celia's pride was wounded a little, but then she would feel ashamed for indulging a trivial vanity. Such petty thoughts were burned away by the intensity of worrying about her daughter. Now that relationship with Joe had been severed so abruptly, Celia was forced to recognise how important he'd become to her. For years she'd relied on him as a friend, a kind of brother really, but he'd also occupied a husbandly place in her life without the romantic components of a marriage. She missed talking to Joe. She missed him. Apart from the early postcard, "Don't worry," Zoe had made no attempt to contact her mother. No message to indicate she was alive, not even through an indirect channel that would preserve the secrecy of her whereabouts. Zoe's silence was meant to punish her mother. Well, Celia hoped that was the reason. It was better than the other possible reasons for silence. And even while she suffered the sting of knowing her daughter hated her, at least it felt like a kind of connection. Sometimes, when Celia needed to conjure up her daughter's presence, she deliberately envisaged an argument, Zoe yelling at her, excoriating, accusing her mother of betrayal and suffocation and crazy behaviour. She imagined her own bleating declarations of good intentions and love. In the imaginary scene, whatever she said only made Zoe angrier and more scornful, but at least her daughter was thumpingly alive in her mind, and there was a small consolation in that. And of course there was a self-lacerating urge, a wish to punch at herself for mistakes made. Before, Celia had never tried to imagine the future too much. There were still 2 more years of school. Zoe would probably have to go away for tertiary study, but that had seemed a long way off still. And any time she had envisioned Zoe's future out in the world, it wasn't this. The next time the pancake hostess appeared to fetch another family, she glanced at Celia and raised her eyebrows. "Can I help you?" Celia smiled and shook her head. "No, you can't help me. Not unless you happen to know where my daughter is." She gave up on the pancake parlour and headed back out into the street. A few days later, when Celia knocked on the door at Freya's house, she must have been looking wretched, because her sister-in-law said nothing after her initial, "Celia." Freya drew her inside and sat her on the big squashy sofa in the sunroom, shooing her 2 little sons out of the room. Celia had been out all night, wandering between locations on her list. Freya's family was just waking up, eating breakfast, preparing for the day. Freya pressed a mug of tea into Celia's hands, then conducted a murmured conversation with her husband in the kitchen. A little later, Celia heard him bundle the kids out the door to school and Freya on the phone to her office, arranging to take the day off work. Celia would normally have protested, not wanting to disrupt their life, but today she was too depleted to argue. She dozed on the sofa for hours, on and off, with Freya offering food, magazines, bath, television, never pressuring Celia to explain herself. Around midday, Celia woke to see her sister-in-law sitting in an armchair nearby, her head angled down over the big folder of work papers on her lap. Freya kept her fair hair layered short, feathered around her face. She had the same creamy colouring as Marcus and Zoe. In the first year after her husband was killed, the grief would hit Celia in waves, forceful and unpredictable. But at the same time, there was Zoe, this creature who needed things, practical things, and who brought an astonishing amount of joy. Extraordinary, the way 2 such strong feelings could exist inside a person's body at the same time. During these strange recent months, Celia discovered that the sorrow of losing Marcus was still present in her body, like a sack of poison that had never been properly absorbed. It was now leaking out, permeating every cell. She was experiencing it freshly, recalling the exact flavour of the pain from all those years ago. Celia had come to her sister-in-law's house today out of the need to be with someone who had known her husband, who had cared about the man as much as she did. She trusted Freya would understand that without needing to discuss it. In fact, the 2 women had only one conversation of any significance during the day. "She hasn't contacted you, has she?" Celia asked. She knew Zoe loved Freya. No. If she rang and swore you to secrecy, if she rang me, I would tell you, said Freya firmly. When Freya went out in the mid-afternoon to collect her kids from school, Celia put her shoes on and left before they came back. From then on, her day-night cycle was permanently inverted. She would sleep in a motel room for a few hours in the middle of the day so she could stay out until the next morning. Night was when she needed to concentrate, because nighttime was when bad things happened to people. Celia couldn't bear the idea of being sunk into mindless sleep at the exact moment Zoe was facing some monster. She needed to summon up images of what might be happening to Zoe and run through the scenes of danger in her head to create a force field around her. And through the night, she scanned the streams of people hopping on buses, eating hamburgers, meeting friends on street corners, and she would have to fight the impulse to roar at them. The earth's crust had split open and sucked her daughter down where she couldn't find her, while all these people were scurrying around on the surface, as if nothing had changed. 15. It had been a heavy-duty night at La Parisienne. The cash register had been a bastard to sort out, and the new waitress possessed the mathematical ability of a house brick. Sheena didn't make it back to the flat until 6 a.m. She eased the bedroom door open to see Murray asleep on the mattress. A month ago, he was kicked out of his share house and she'd let him move his stuff into her room for a while. He'd been there ever since. Sheena was well aware she was a bad-tempered scrag, intolerant of other people's habits, bodily noises, and the stupid thoughts she knew were buzzing through their heads. But the truth was, she hated being alone more than she hated the irritating proximity of other human beings. This was a pathetic way to be. She wished she could hack being on her own. It was one of the things she admired about Celia. Running that farm single-handed, handling so many solitary hours during the day and then every night in her bed alone. Anyway, Sheena had meandered into a live-in relationship with the Dickless Wonder again, a situation that turned out to be pretty ordinary, exactly as she would have predicted it would be, which made her angry with herself and even more pissed off with the world. Murray had 2 part-time jobs when he moved in, but both of those evaporated. There was then a lot of yappity-yap about well-paid work coming up, dudes who will be calling, excellent opportunities on the horizon. But of course, no dudes called and the horizon was unobscured by any opportunities. Sheena couldn't kid herself anymore. She was supporting a guy whose only contribution to her life, other than his pretty average cock, was the bong water he spilled on the carpet of the flat, for which she paid the rent. Murray wasn't a bad guy. He could be funny sometimes, and he wasn't nasty or violent or criminal, apart from dealing a small amount of weed. He put up with Sheena's sour moods. Her snarky comments just slid off his Teflon-coated surface. That placid demeanour was another facet of his profound laziness. He wouldn't waste energy reacting to stuff she said to him, especially if there was a risk she would be less likely to buy the milk and cereal that sustained him. Opportunistic sloth was his gift, like a moss growing on other plants to suck up their nutrients. Sheena lay on the mattress, too exhausted to strip off her work uniform, let alone have a shower. Murray, flaked out in the bed, flopped his sleepy arm heavily across her belly, and then his fingers gradually woke up, snaking inside the top of her fishnets, like a parasitic organism burrowing its way into the host animal. Sheena sighed, poised to slap his hand away, but then she changed her mind, yanked the wretched fishnets down her thighs and tossed them on the floor. Murray would be easier to handle all day if he scored a root. And she was in such a low mood, she wanted to feel someone touching her. Moments later, he was humping away on top of her. His dick was the least lazy part of him. With his neck pressed against Sheena's face, he smelled of dope and the coloured popcorn he liked to buy in jumbo packets. Lying under him now, she recalled a stupid conversation they'd had a few days before. She had been watching him as he sat in front of the TV with a big plastic bowl of the sugar-encrusted kiddie popcorn, selecting one colour at a time, the bright red ones or the electric blue ones, to pop into his gob. "What's the colour thing in aid of?" she had asked. "Why do you do that?" "I don't want to mix the flavours up in my mouth," explained Murray, the genius. "That's just artificial colouring, not actual flavour, you moron." "What flavour do you reckon the red ones are?" "Strawberry?" Murray shrugged. "Some kind of fruit?" "Fruit. Do you honestly believe a piece of fruit has been within 2 miles of that piece of crap?" He didn't respond. Just kept staring at the screen and chewing with his stupid mouth slightly open. He started to pick out the blue bits of candied popcorn. She knew it was crazy to persist, but she couldn't help it. "What flavour can you detect in the blue ones you're eating now?" "Blue flavour? Try eating them blindfolded, you monumental tool. They all taste the fucking same. They're taste of sugar." "How come you care so much about the way I eat popcorn?" he asked. "I don't care. I don't care. I don't fucking care." She had snarled and forced herself to walk away into the bedroom. She didn't like the person she was with him. He might be a gormless slob, but when she was with him, she became a carping witch. Now, in bed, Murray was emitting the little gasping grunts he made when he was working for his orgasm. She fantasized they were choking noises of him getting popcorn stuck in his throat. In the past, there had always been some variety of Kieran crisis that would allow Sheena to extricate herself from a substandard situation. These were never phony excuses. They were real messes that required a rescue mission by Sheena. But now she didn't even have the excuse of Kieran, seeing as she'd cut dead, all feeling for her brother. After the sex, Murray flopped over on his side of the bed and was snuffling back to unconsciousness. Sheena should have done the same, but she was too scratchy and antsy to sleep. She jumped out of bed, pulled on jeans and a clean t-shirt, and headed out the door, intending to get her ears re-pierced. She'd taken out the hoops during her stint picking fruit, and the holes had closed over since the summer. Now, suddenly, today, she was seized by the need to get them re-pierced as soon as possible. It was once she was out on the street that she realised it was still only 6:30, too early for any piercing place to be open. Even the tattoo parlours shut for a few hours after 4 a.m. There was a chemist shop on Surfers Paradise Boulevard that might open fairly soon. She'd seen a lady in there doing ear piercing at a little setup in the corner, wearing a white zip-up uniform to give the impression she was some kind of medical professional. In fact, she was just a lady who worked in a shop selling tampons and tinea cream. Sheena headed in the direction of that chemist, which meant walking past shop fronts. In the plate glass windows, she caught her reflection at an unexpected angle that made her suddenly see herself. She was surprised how young she looked. Sheena had only just turned 28, but she felt so much older than that. She turned away from the shop windows and walked out to the esplanade. She was just crossing to the grassy part when a young guy swung around the corner on a motorbike. Kieran, riding without a helmet, which was the kind of stupid shit he would do. So Kieran had stumbled his way up to Queensland, which wasn't surprising. But a second later, the motorcyclist turned his head, and he wasn't Kieran. From the age of 5, Sheena had been lumped with looking after her younger brothers as each baby came home from hospital, to whichever house they were living in and whichever bloke her mother was shacked up with at the time. Even as a little kid, she knew her mother couldn't be relied on to take care of her own babies. Not for every single moment babies needed looking after. Sheena didn't know when she acquired this awareness of her mother's inadequacies. It was just knowledge, there in her head, before conscious memory. So Sheena had to do it, look after her brothers, because she didn't want to be responsible for them starving to death or falling off the landing and cracking their baby skulls open. But she resented it, fiercely. Those babies stank and shat and cried so fucking loudly, it was like someone punching her constantly in the temple. Her mother's boyfriends were never much use. even when the bawling, shitting baby in question was the fruit of their particular loins. And the babies themselves never took into account who did the looking after. They were just as likely to puke up on Sheena and then smile at some random loser who'd never done anything for them. By the time Kieran, the fourth brother, was born, Sheena was 9 years old and already an angry, dark girl with low expectations of the adults assembled around her and suspicions about the world beyond them. From the day Kieran came home from the hospital, he was different from the other brothers. He looked up at Sheena from the crib and they locked eyes. She loved him passionately, furiously. He didn't sleep much. When he was so full of twitchy beans that he was driving everyone else in the house mental, Sheena would chuck him in the pram and wheel him around the neighbourhood. He'd be cheerful little fucker then, squealing and laughing and yabbering to every person, dog or rubbish bin they passed. His smile was one of the few things on earth that could spark joy in cranky little Sheena. She knew she wasn't being singled out for those smiles. Kieran loved everyone. But that didn't matter to her. It was her job to protect this brother. In return, she was able to tap into the positive energy source he had brought into their house. Taking care of this brother as he grew up wasn't easy. Once their hopeless family and the messed up world were stirred in with Kieran's own dizzy personality. Especially once he started getting himself entangled with a poisonous type like Mick. Over the last couple of years, there had been many times Sheena vowed to give up on Kieran and keep her distance from the family. Even so, whenever there was a crisis involving her youngest brother, she would go back. But that last time would be the last time. She had driven him away from Sydney with clean pillowcases wrapped around his bleeding, cut-up feet while he slept on the back seat. Driving through the night and the next morning, she kept twisting around to look at his sleeping face, checking he was breathing, as she had when he was a toddler with bronchitis. On that trip out west, she had doubted she could bear it anymore. That is, the desperate business of hoping Kieran would stay alive. She should have realised that whole trip was pointless. She couldn't drive him away from risky situations. She couldn't transport Kieran beyond his own capacity to get into trouble. And then, when he ran off with that girl, he had pissed all over every attempt she'd ever made to help him. So, fuck him. At times in the past 5 months, Sheena had had an urge to ring Celia, or the old lady. She kept both their phone numbers on a piece of paper in the leather pouch she used for her jewellery. She could ring and ask if they'd heard anything, had seen Kieran, whatever. But she must resist that urge. She couldn't be drawn back into caring or even wondering what happened to him. By now she had walked down close to the beach. There were only a few surfers and people walking their dogs, an overtanned old dude in Speedos, leathery skin puckered across his chest, jogged along the sand in front of her. Sheena took a few steps closer to the water and angled her gaze away from the surf break, so no one was in her eye line. From the spot she was standing, with an unobstructed view of the ocean and the morning sky, you would have no idea Surfer's Paradise was right behind you. You could kid yourself, none of that shit existed. Sheena kicked off her sneakers and slipped the money from her pocket into the toe of one shoe. Then she walked straight into the water, pausing to allow each breaking wave to bash against her jeans before wading further out. This was better than a shower. Once she was out deep enough, she dived under again and again. She flicked her head around underwater, rinsing the smell of Murray and Tia Maria and other people's cigarettes out of her hair. She let the clean salt water flush out all the accumulated crap in her head and the sand scour away any last bits of filth. When she stepped out of the water, she carried her shoes and walked barefoot back to the flat, her sodden jeans and t-shirt sticking to her and the fine crust of salt drying on her face. Murray was still asleep, so she thumped the door jamb a couple of times. He sat up, squinting, confused to see Sheena's wet hair dripping on the carpet. "I'm leaving," she said. "To go where?" "Not sure. Maybe Sydney to start with?" "Cool. If you lend me enough for the bus, I'll come with you." No, you moron. I'm leaving you. I'm breaking up with you. That's the whole point of going too. Well, that's part of why I'm going to Sydney. To do what? I don't know. But not this. In late July, Rosa saw the headlights of the ute pass by her house just before dawn. By the time Rosa had walked up the path to Celia's house, Celia had already put herself into bed. She never explained why she had abandoned the search in the city, but from what Rosa could see, her beloved friend was worn out beyond a person's ability to function in the world, and sleep-deprived to the point of delirium. It had been an act of foolishness for Celia to drive a vehicle all the way back to the district in such a state, and a piece of luck there had not been an accident. Perhaps she planned to recuperate a while and then head back out on her searching. She didn't say, and Rosa didn't ask. Joe rushed out to the property the moment Rosa told him Celia was home. He bought bags and bags of food to stock Celia's fridge. He insisted his mother point out little jobs that needed doing around Celia's house so he had an excuse to linger for some hours, until she emerged from the bedroom. "Hello, Joe," she said as she padded out to the kitchen in socks, wearing baggy track pants and a voluminous Aran sweater that had belonged to her husband. Celia's body barely seemed to be present inside the loose folds of fabric. "Hi," said Joe. Rosa watched him take a step forward, arms lifting slightly, ready to fold Celia into him. But then, suddenly not sure his embrace would be welcome, he dropped his hands and slid them down the side of his suit pants. Maybe she was radiating a "don't touch me" signal that Joe detected. Maybe she seemed too fragile to engage with another person, even if it was just the engagement required to receive a comforting embrace. Or perhaps what Celia really wanted was for Joe to shred all those doubts and cautions so he could reach across and grab her firmly. Either way, he stood awkwardly in the middle of the kitchen and she remained in the doorway. "Mum's filled me in on the latest," he said. "I'll let you know if I hear anything." Celia nodded, an anemic smile. "I hope you'll tell me if there's anything I can do," said Joe. Now she was back home. Celia stayed indoors, much of the time in bed. If anyone came to the door, she pretended to be asleep. After a while, local friends understood she didn't want visitors, so they kept away and just rang Rosa from time to check up. Rosa cooked food that might tempt Celia to eat. Walking up every day to collect the used-up dish from the kitchen bench and put a fresh meal in the fridge. From what she could see, Celia wasn't eating a great amount. Just enough to live. 16. Sheena hadn't spent time inside many men's toilets in her life, but she'd seen a few, enough to reckon that the front bar of this pub, with its insipid green tiles, yellow linoleum floor and mirrors eaten away at the edges like leprosy, looked a lot like a gent's. As she walked in, she regretted suggesting it as a meeting place. There were a couple of other hotels around Parramatta that had been revamped, done up like a Spanish hacienda or filled with fake Tudor shit. Maybe she should have picked one of those. She wouldn't want anyone thinking this kind of grotty old bloke's bar was her natural habitat. But the location of this pub was easy to explain. And anyway, people always thought whatever they wanted to think, no matter what she did. She spotted Joe at one of the window tables. He'd probably got there dead set early. He was that kind of guy. He stood as she walked over, and they said hi simultaneously. There was an awkward little manoeuvre on approach, with Joe presumably unsure about the etiquette for greeting a younger woman he'd fucked once, a woman whose drug-addled brother had run off with his sort of niece and torn out the heart of the girl's mother. Sheena wasn't too sure about the etiquette from her end either. So they both froze for a second until Joe lurched forward to give her a peck on the cheek. "Thanks for meeting me," he said. "Let me get you a drink." "Sure, ta, a midi." While Joe stood at the bar, getting them both beers, Sheena had a chance to observe him for a moment. He was an attractive man, even though she'd never gone for older guys as a rule. She remembered what his body looked like under that suit. It was weird to dwell on her intimate knowledge of the body of a person she'd shagged, but a person she didn't know very well and certainly had no claim on. After Sheena had broken up with the Dickless Wonder for the last time, she'd returned to Sydney and collected her mail that was supposed to have been forwarded. Most of the envelopes had little holes where snails had chewed the paper while the mail sat in the letterbox for too long. There was nothing from Kieran, not that she had any reason to expect he'd suddenly take up letter writing, or that he'd want to make contact with his bitch sister at all. She had landed a factory job in Blacktown, filling shampoo bottles. It was as boring as batshit, but then again, it was probably wise to take a break from dealing with the public. Sheena had always been good at reeling in work and earning her own money. This time, she was determined not to repeat past patterns, by also reeling in a boyfriend who would happily sponge off her earnings. Then 2 days ago, she received word that some guy was trying to track her down, phoning various places she'd lived, leaving messages. When she rang back the number, it turned out the guy looking for her was Joe. "How are you, Sheena?" he said, putting the beers on the table between them. "Okay. I was up the Gold Coast for a few months. Back here now." Joe drew a breath to ask Sheena a follow-up question. She didn't want him to feel obliged to make chat and show some phony interest in her life, so she quickly said, "How's Celia going?" "Not good." That poor woman must be going mental. Joe had explained on the phone that Zoe was still missing, with no calls, no messages, nothing. "Have you had any contact with Kieran?" Joe asked. "No." "If he does contact you, I hope you'll..." Sheena jumped in. "Yeah, of course. I'd let Celia know straight away." She was offended he thought she was the kind of lowlife who didn't care enough about people to do the right thing. Yes, I know you would," said Joe. "I was going to say, I hope you'll let me know if I can help. If Kieran needs legal advice, call me." "Ah, right." Sheena could feel herself stuck in guarded mode, and her voice came out sharper than it should. "Don't feel like you owe me anything. Your brother might need help. I'm able to offer some, that's all." "Okay, thanks." Sheena felt like an idiot. She'd forgotten about Joe's nice guy manners, and she had slapped his kindness away ungraciously. She should stop doing that. There was an awkward silence which Joe filled by saying something even more awkward. "Heather, my wife, she and I have separated. I've moved out." "Oh." "It was a long time coming, really." "Fair enough. Still, I'm sorry if the thing with you and me, Please don't worry. It wasn't your fault in any way. I would say the thing that galvanized my decision to let the marriage go was, well, part of it was listening to the mean-spirited way Heather spoke about Celia. She was gloating about her suffering, being judgmental and uncharitable about it. I couldn't stand hearing it, and I couldn't stand being married to someone who speaks like that about people." "Sure, I get you," said Sheena. She took a punt that a sly comment might be allowed at this point. "Rosa would be stoked to know you share her opinion about Heather being a hard-hearted witch." Joe laughed. "Oh, yeah. Mum would love to hear me say that." They both smiled, and it suddenly felt intimate between them. There, in that grotty pub. It struck Sheena that he'd asked to meet because he wanted to pursue something with her. She was thrown off balance, trying to decipher her own feelings about this prospect. But before she had a chance to think, Joe changed gear, getting down to the real reason he was here. "Anyway," he said, "I'm planning to stay in Sydney for a while. See if I can find any trace of Zoe. Any information is going to make things easier. Easier for Celia." She heard the way he said the name, concentrating all his energy and yearning into the word Celia. And it was instantly clear he had no interest in Sheena beyond a kind regard. She registered a flicker of disappointment in herself. Surprising. In some pathetic back pocket of her mind, she must have nursed a fantasy about being with someone like this man. But a second later, any soppy disappointment was cauterized. Sheena knew how the world worked and her place in it. Looking at Joe, sitting in front of her now, Sheena was sure the guy was helplessly in love with Celia. He loved that woman without any expectation she would ever love him back. And he would do anything to save her from suffering. Someone in the world looking out for you. Everyone wanted that. "I wouldn't get your hopes up about finding Zoe," Sheena said. "Seems like she doesn't want to be found. But look, I can check out the palaces my brother crashes in." "Thanks, Sheena. I really appreciate it. I'm working out of an office in town for a while." Joe passed her a card with a Sydney phone number on it. "You can always leave a message for me here and I'll call you back." It took Sheena a few days, several annoying phone calls, 2 trains, and 1 bus trip to track her mother down. When she found the place, she had to check the address on the piece of paper. No way her scrag of a mother could be living in this posh suburban pile with its ostentatious portico. It was in a cul-de-sac of equally grandiose, recently built houses, all the construction so new and fake you could smell the concrete and glue and paint. When Sheena's mother opened the front door, she appeared startled to see her eldest child and only daughter standing there. Oh, she mumbled. The woman had never had a lot going on in the social skills department. "G'day, Dawn," said Sheena. From the age of 6, Sheena had called her mother by her first name. She'd never acted like a mum, so there was no way Sheena was going to offer up that word. The 2 women didn't hug or kiss. Dawn had always been keen to paw and be pawed by whichever man she was with at the time, but she'd not been much of a cuddler of her children, and Sheena figured it would be hypocritical to introduce physical affection into the equation now. "Can I come in?" Sheena asked. Dawn laughed nervously and wiggled her head in a little display of "I've forgotten my manners." Yeah, come inside. Just shocked to see you here. Come in." Sheena was surprised Dawn looked so pulled together. Her hair was bleached to a brittle frost, but with no dark roots showing, and it was smoothly brushed. She was wearing makeup, even home alone in the daytime. Sure, the foundation was too thick, slapped on with a trowel, and someone should have told her to go easy on the clumpy coats of mascara and shiny pale lipstick. But still, she was making an effort. Sheena followed her mother into the house. Dawn was wearing mauve velour pants that snugly packaged her bum, and a tight embroidered top that showed off the fact that she had a neat little waist. Sheena knew Dawn's figure was more or less identical to the body shape Sheena herself walked around in. It was upsetting to face a biological link to this person. She hated the idea there was shared genetic code ticking away in her body. Inside, there was a lot of reproduction, French polished furniture, gilt-frame mirrors, stiffly upholstered chairs, velvet curtains with tassels. The kind of interior design that says, "Did you not know I'm a duchess?" Hanging over the main living room was a chandelier, a fucking-lier. Sheena would hate to live in a place like this, but even so, it annoyed the shit out of her that Dawn had scored this house. How was it right that her mother had stumbled her way to a cozy deal after creating so much havoc and populating the world with her screwed-up children? "Let's not sit in here. When I'm in here, I always feel—" Dawn shrugged. She was never good at retrieving words, on account of marinating her brain in booze for too many years. Sheena finished the thought for her. "You always feel like you've got to stick up your bum." Dawn giggled at that. A woman of 46, mother of 5, giggling like a brainless schoolgirl. She led the way through the vast new kitchen and waved her hand at the fridge. "Can I get you anything?" How about a decent childhood, Sheena thought, but she didn't say it aloud. "Nothing for me, thanks," she said. Dawn ushered Sheena into the casual living room at the rear of the house, where the decor suddenly morphed into modern and space-agey, with a white leather sofa, chrome and glass tables, white shag rugs, and huge sliding doors opening onto a patio and a lawn so newly laid you could still see the squares of turf. "Fuck me dead, Dawn. You landed on your feet here?" Dawn giggled. "I know. Oh, but probably won't be here long. Sal's the guy the latest guy you found to make all your dreams come true." Dawn registered the sour note in Sheena's voice. The woman was dim, but not that dim. But she ignored it, to avoid getting more of a mouthful from her daughter. "Sal's in the building trade. Once he gets the right price for this place, we'll be moving." Sheena nodded and scanned the property, as if doing her own quick real estate valuation. Dawn was looking over at her through mascara-clumped eyelashes, wary. Sheena knew her mother was worried she was going to blame her for something or ask something of her. And it was true that Sheena's guts were clenched for a fight. She could envisage how the scene would go, her snarling abuse about Dawn's selfishness, while her mother spluttered out justifications, scrunching up her face tightly, as if that could stop Sheena's words going into her brain. For the moment, Sheena controlled her tongue and asked, "Do you know where Kieran is?" "No clue. You'd be more likely to know than anyone else in this family." "And why would that be, do you reckon?" snapped Sheena. "Yes, okay, Sheena. But there's something here I should..." Dawn moved across the room to a buffet where there was a pile of loose papers and mail. She stumbled a little in her rainbow stripe-heeled slippers, maybe because the tiles were polished to a treacherous gloss. But then Sheena saw her mother reach out to steady herself on the edge of the buffet, the kind of fake, casual maneuver people use to hide their pissed condition. It was 11 in the morning, and the woman had already been into the Bacardi or whatever was her current drink of choice. Then Sheena noticed the marks on her mother's upper arm, finger marks from being yanked around by a big builder's paw. And there was bruising across her cheek, which explained why Dawn was wearing so much foundation. Traditionally, Sheena would have used the bruises as a cue to lay into Dawn about her stupid life management, but she felt too tired to crank up that speech. So tired she even felt a glimmer of pity for this floundering woman who happened to have given birth to her. Sheena decided to give herself and Dawn a break by not launching into that argument today. Dawn waved a piece of notepaper with a cartoon kitten on the top. "A cop rang here looking for you." "For me?" "The police found your car. Out Durrell Way, where those 5-acre places are. The guy said it had been stripped." "Well, Kieran had my car. Did the cop say what happened?" "No, they asked me a lot of questions about Kieran, but said they want to talk to him. He's in some trouble, I think." Dawn did an apologetic wince, as if the duty to do something helpful about her son's fucked up life was a minor task she had naughtily neglected. In that moment, Sheena could easily have reached across to grab one of the glass and chrome side tables and smash it over Dawn's head until her mother's blood splattered out all over the white tiles. But what would be the point? Dawn held out the notepaper. "There's a number of the cop anyway. I suppose you should ring them? Oh, wait, let me just..." She scribbled something next to the cartoon kitten. "And this is our number, at this place. Oh, but, I don't know how long we're going to be here." Sheena took the notepaper with her mother's temporary phone number and the number of the policeman searching for her brother. That was the nearest the woman could come to maintaining connection with her offspring. "Ta," said Sheena, as she pushed the note into her pocket. 17. Rosa walked along the corridor of sunlight on her way up to Celia's house. The way the light fell between the trees around midday at this time of year, this section of the path was always a warm patch. She was carrying a paprika chicken dish in a round earthenware pot covered with aluminium foil. It felt heavy as she looked down at the loose skin on her chickeny wrists. She did not enjoy being so woefully old. Passing close by the cabin in the orchard, Rosa heard a small clunk, followed by a louder clunk. She stopped still, to hush the crunching of her shoes on the winter dry grass. She waited, listening for more odd sounds, but it was quiet, except for the swish of the windbreak pines. "The dementia is getting you now, old chicken," she said to herself. Then as she reached the garden of Celia's house, Rosa looked behind her and caught a flash of blue in the orchard near the shack. Either someone was down there or her mind had slipped off the rails. She put the earthenware pot down on the edge of the veranda and yelled towards the window. "Celia, you should come. Someone is here, I think, by the cabin." Rosa hurried back towards the orchard, calling out, "Hello? Are you there? Someone? Or are you an animal?" If someone was there, they made no response. Celia was squinting against the daylight as she walked down from the house. "What's going on?" Rosa pointed to the cabin. "Who's there?" Celia called out. "Zoe? Is that you?" Celia ventured close enough to push open the door of the shack. Rosa could see how much she was hoping. Sometimes it was dangerous to hope so much. The cabin was empty, and Celia let the door swing shut again. Both of us are imagining things that aren't there. Celia turned to walk away, but then a thumping noise from behind the shack made her spin round. "Who's there?" She picked up a lump of wood from the ground as a weapon. Rosa wasn't sure a lump of wood would be much protection if there was a treacherous individual behind the shack. But Celia looked fierce as she held it out from her body, like a woman who would at least put up a fight. "If someone is there, come out now." There was a rustle in the weeds around the footings of the building, and then Kieran stepped into view. Celia demanded, "Is she with you? Is she with you? Is she with you?" The boy shook his head. He was filthy, the sleeve of his blue sweatshirt torn open to reveal an ugly gash on his shoulder. But it was the face that shocked Rosa. 24 or more small wounds sprayed across his neck and face, some of them scabbed over, others with the scabs torn off and freshly bleeding. Would a person do this to themselves? Would an animal shred a man's face like that? "Is Zoe here?" he asked. "Don't you bullshit me. Tell me where she is." "I don't know," Kieran said feebly. "I thought she'd come home. Is she here?" "No, she's not." "When did you last see her? Did she tell you she was coming home?" He was shaking his head, saying no, but also trying to shake things clear inside his skull. "I don't know where she is. That's why I came back here. Fuck. Celia took a step closer to him, still holding the wood like a weapon. "Listen to me, you piece of shit. You tell me right now where I can find her." Kieran scrunched up his face, afraid she would clobber him. "I don't know, really." Blood was beading on his forehead and temples, where the face scrunching had torn open the little cuts. "Where did you last see her?" "Sydney. Well, near Sydney," he said. "But then we lost each other. Give me a list of places. I can look." Kieran was shaking his head. "I already looked every place I could think. If I knew where she was, I wouldn't be here." He whimpered, then rallied a little and fixed Celia with a desperate look. Wait, you're trying to trick me. Asking me, she's really inside, isn't she? She's in there and you won't let me see her." He shouted up towards the house. Zoe, it's me." But a moment later, he crumpled back to a pleading mode. "I just want to talk to her, please. Let me talk to her. She's inside. She's asleep in bed, tucked up in bed in her old room, isn't she?" "No." This time he heard the misery soaking through Celia's voice, and he understood she was telling the truth. "Oh, she's not here." Celia didn't answer, so Rosa said, "No, she's not. The last time you saw Zoe, she was okay? She was in one piece?" Yes. But now I don't know. I'll wait for her. She'll come back home. I'll wait." Celia growled at the boy. "You get off my property. I don't want you anywhere near this place. Kieran was agitated, his limbs overtaken by the fidgety movements Rosa had noted the first day he appeared in the packing yard. You hate me, he said to Celia. I get that. Fair enough. But I can't go. I have to see her. If you don't get off my property right now, I'll ring the police. That might make trouble with the cops for Zoe, Kieran countered. I know you don't want that. Celia stabbed the hunk of wood in the air towards the young man, and Rosa thought she might really hit him this time. Bugger off, you little shit. I don't want to look at you. Get away from here. Kieran moved backwards, towards the road. Okay, I'll stay off your property, but I can't go away. She'll come back here. I'm sorry to be a shit, but I'll do whatever I have to do to see her. You can't make me go away. Celia roared at him, and he turned, running through the orchard, over the fence and off the property. Once Kieran was out of her line of sight, Celia dropped the lump of wood. I should go to Sydney, find her. Where? The boy can't give you any useful information, Rosa pointed out. You saw how he was. And what if he's right? What if Zoe comes back here? He seems so sure she's coming home. He does. Later in the afternoon, when the sun was almost gone and the cold was seeping through the ground, Rosa walked from her cottage along the public roadway to where the boy was waiting. From the spot he'd chosen, he would see any person driving through Celia's farm gate and could see the very edge of the garden around the house. Are you planning to stay out here all night? Rosa asked. This is a stupid thing. There is a bed for you in my house, and hot food too. Thank you, he said, but no thanks. For the next 2 nights and days, Kieran waited in his spot on the roadside near Celia's front gate. There was some rain during this time, enough to soak the boy's clothes through to the skin, and in the mornings there was frost over the ground that must have bitten through to his bones. But he did not budge himself. Celia patrolled the orchard and the driveway to make sure the boy stayed off the place. She yelled, "Piss off!" like someone snarling at a stray dog. Kieran did not budge himself. He was afraid that if he moved from his watching spot, he would miss Zoe coming home. Rosa could also see that the bitter conditions, his poor battered face, Celia's vicious shouting, the young man thought he deserved such punishment. Late on the 3rd day, Rosa walked up to find Celia in the yard of the packing shed. I think you need to talk to the boy, said Rosa. 2 nights he's been out there. Celia shrugged. If I could get the police to drag him away, I would. But all he wants... If he can't help me find her, he's no use to me, snapped Celia, and walked inside the shed. Some people might consider Rosa was being an interfering mad old lady when she walked down the driveway and signalled to Kieran, beckoning him towards her. But it was Rosa's opinion that sometimes mad old ladies should interfere. A few moments later, when Celia emerged from the shed, the young man was standing right in front of her. Taken by surprise, Celia stopped, silent. Kieran too was speechless, unsure he had any right to request anything from this woman. Rosa had to gesture to him. Speak. I was wondering if... Has Zoe called you? You don't have to tell me if she's called. I mean, that's your right. She hasn't called. I tried to get her to ring you heaps of times. I should have tried harder. I should have made her do it. I'm really sorry. Are you? Celia stared at him harsh. Yes. I'm so sorry. I messed everything up. I know that. She watched him, her body rigid, determined to feel nothing for this boy. Kieran was shaking, from hunger or injury or distress, probably from all of these. He rubbed both his hands over his face, as if he could clear his mind that way. I don't mean to, but I make dumb mistakes and everything gets stuffed up. The roughness of his hands was tearing off the scabs. Don't do that, said Celia firmly. You're making yourself bleed. Kieran didn't seem to notice. and kept rubbing his hand back and forth across his ravaged skin. "I want you to know, please. No, I'm sorry. I'm really sorry." "Hey, look what you're doing." Celia took a step towards him and grabbed one of his wrists to pull it away from his face. "Don't do that to yourself." Kieran looked down at his hands, the palms bloody from the reopened cuts. "What happened to your face?" she asked him. I fell." "Your shoulder should have had stitches." Kieran swayed a little, groggy on his feet. "Sit down a minute. Don't fall over." Celia kept her tone hard and unyielding, as if her main concern was not wanting him to bleed inconveniently on her property. Rosa ducked into the shed, and by the time she came back out, Kieran had managed to stumble across a few steps to sit on a pile of wooden pallets. Rosa held out the first aid box she'd fetched from inside. "My old lady hands are too shaky for this job." Celia flashed a dirty look at Rosa, but then she took the first aid kit and propped it open on the pallets. Steadfastly, avoiding eye contact with Kieran, she began to methodically clean up the wounds on his face and shoulder. "Keep still," she said, and the boy obeyed. She soaked cotton wool in antiseptic to dab on the broken skin. "This will sting." "No worries, thanks. Already hurts anyway, thanks." Maybe Celia enjoyed inflicting the little stabs of pain on him, but she was also doing a careful job of cleaning the cuts and taping gauze over the worst ones. Rosa was of the belief that it was possible for a person to sustain two strong and apparently conflicting impulses at the same time. A desire, for example, to slice this young man into small, agonized pieces, and an inclination to care for the injured creature in front of her. "When you last saw Zoe, how was she?" Celia asked him. "I want you to know things were great. To begin with, things were great. Me and Zoe looked after each other, and I was trying to fix things, but then everything got messed around. We ended up getting separated." Celia stepped away from Kieran in order to throw the used cotton wool in an empty box, but also, Rosa suspected, in order to move away from this boy she was tempted to smash. Kieran was full of tears now, too distressed to speak clearly. "You've got to believe me. I would never do anything to hurt Zoe. I thought we could look after each other. Please believe me. I'm sorry. I'm sorry." When Celia turned around, she was startled to see the boy had slid himself off the pallets and onto the ground right at her feet. He grabbed onto her legs, like a small child in the supermarket mistaking a stranger's legs for their mother's. But this wasn't a confused toddler. This was the young man who had stolen away her daughter. Kieran wept, big sobs tearing out from his belly. Celia stood there, paralysed. Eventually she lifted her hand and Rosa wondered if she was going to punch him in the head. But, in fact, she just touched his hair. The boy cried for a long time, and Celia realised she couldn't ask him any more questions in this state. Finally, she extricated herself from Kieran and walked away, speaking to Rosa in a voice as dry and flat as she could manage. "I suppose he can sleep in the cabin tonight." "Yes," said Rosa. "Yes. I'll bring blankets and food from my house." "Don't you worry about it, Celia." 18. In the morning, Celia stirred several teaspoons of sugar into a thermos of milky tea, knowing that Kieran liked to drink things sweet. She put the thermos in a string bag along with a cheese sandwich, an apple, a clean shirt, and a warm sweater. Walking down through the orchard, she was surprised to see the cabin door wide open. Maybe he had scarpered during the night. Celia wasn't sure whether she would be relieved or disappointed to find Kieran gone. His appearance on the property was maddening. But he was also, in his frustrating, hopeless way, the only connection she had to her daughter. Closer, she could see he was still inside the cabin, asleep on one of the lower bunks. He must have wedged the door open to get rid of the fusty smell inside, left to go mouldy during that damp winter with no one around to air the place out. Celia stood outside for a moment and watched the sleeping young man tucked inside a nest of blankets and eiderdowns Rosa had brought him. The small cuts on his face were scabbed over again, and the deeper ones had only bled through the gauze a little. The wounds looked okay, not infected. Apart from the injuries, Kieran's face looked different, possibly transforming into his adult face, or maybe just temporarily showing the strain of recent ordeals. When he eventually woke and saw Celia watching him through the doorway, he jerked his body upright, as far as he could in the limited space of the bunk. "Oh, sorry. Was he sorry for waking up? Or for not waking up sooner? Maybe he was stung with remorse simply for being in Celia's field of vision, apologising for his very existence. And so he should, the little shit. "I bought you some food, clothes," she said, and slid the string bag through the door of the cabin without stepping inside. "Thanks. Sorry. Far out. You don't need to do anything for me. Sorry you have to put up with fuck. Sorry. Thanks. Thank you." To stop him blathering out thanks and apologies, Celia nodded briskly and left. At the house, she made phone calls. The police, hospitals, the private investigator she was still paying too much money, but without mentioning Kieran. Several times she lifted the phone to ring the cops back and dob him in, have the bastard arrested. Each time, as she listened to the dial tone, a flare of anger burned along her sternum, but each time she hesitated, then dropped the receiver back in the cradle. She didn't want to cause trouble for Zoe. Later in the morning, Celia headed back to the cabin with a new plan. She would stay calm, quiz Kieran further, extract whatever useful information she could, and then demand he leave. His injuries were healing. He had been fed and then slept the night in a warm bed, so it would not be too callous to ask him to move on now. When Celia reached the yard and looked out into the orchard, she couldn't miss the vivid shape of Rosa in her red jumper and gaudy mirrored skirt. Rosa was strolling between the rows of peach trees, supervising Kieran, putting him to work clearing the ground around the trunks. "Something is better than nothing, don't you think?" Rosa called out to Celia, flapping her hands at the straggly trees choked with weeds. Kieran kept his head down, intent on the task, as if dealing with an emergency. He was throwing his body at the work, so vigorous and relentless, he must surely have been hurting his injured shoulder. Celia spent an hour in the shed working on the tractor to coax the thing into running again after its long hibernation. She enjoyed the methodical sequence of chores, changing the oil, cleaning the spark plugs and carburetor, and when the engine rumbled into life, there was an unexpectedly intense level of satisfaction. She drove the tractor along the track between the fruit trees, pushing the jumble of slashed grass, weeds, and brittle branches down the slope into a huge pile outside the orchard. As she chugged through, Kieran avoided eye contact with her. Maybe he could sense the fantasy that was dancing across Celia's mind as she passed him. It would just take a swing of the steering wheel to slam Kieran against the trunk of a tree with the tractor blade, squelching him. She allowed herself to relish that image, satisfying in a dumb, childish way. And then, as she repeated the brutal images in her mind, there was a purgative effect, draining away some of her anger towards the boy, like drawing pus from an abscess. At midday, Rosa spread a rug on top of the stack of pallets in the yard and laid out lunch, including small chicken pies she'd baked. Celia had not had an appetite for months. She'd taken enough sustenance to keep herself functioning, but any food had been flavourless, like a mouthful of nothing, or sometimes worse, like a mouthful of sandy nothing that she had to chew in her dry mouth and force her throat to swallow. But the smell of those pies, still warm from the oven, made her feel a twinge of hunger. "Thank you, Rosa. They look delicious," Celia said, and sat on the edge of the pallets to eat. "This is very kind." "It's always a good idea to eat," said Rosa, then signalled to Kieran to come and get himself some of the food. He walked up to the yard from the orchard and ventured close enough to take one of the pies, and then, with a nod of thanks, retreated a few steps. He reminded Celia of her old Kelpie collie Cross, who would snatch meat scraps out of his food bowl and take them away to eat in a corner. Celia reckoned the boy wasn't afraid of her exactly. If he was submissive, careful not to get in her face too much, it was out of fear she would send him away. He still hoped Zoe would show up here and didn't want to risk missing her. Rosa was muttering to herself in Hungarian and then indicating that she'd forgotten something. She headed down towards her own house, leaving Celia and Kieran alone in the yard. The boy was uneasy, sitting close to her, without Rosa or work or any other distractions in between. He stayed very still, tackling the pie with small apologetic bites. Eventually, Celia broke the silence. "When you and Zoe first left here, where did you go?" Kieran jerked, surprised she was addressing him. "I know you didn't go straight to Sydney," Celia added. "Okay, look, the thing is, when me and Zoe left, we stayed away from trouble. I want you to know that. No trouble." Celia set her face hard. She didn't want to listen to snivelling or excuses from Kieran. She just wanted to hear what had happened to her daughter. "You needed to find work, I suppose." "To start with, we had some money for food and petrol and stuff," he explained. "I mean money Zoe brought with her." Celia already knew that. On her dressing table, Zoe had kept a money box, a little china cottage with a pixie perched on the roof in a jaunty pose, which held the cash she was saving for a car. The pixie was face down now, with a black rubber plug on the underside of the cottage removed when Zoe had hooked out the cash. "And Zoe was dead set to chew up some miles, you know?" "A road trip?" "Exactly, yeah. And she wanted to do half the driving. I said no way, because she doesn't have a license. I mean, I know she drives the vehicles on this farm, but that's not the same as driving on the highway. I went, what if we get pulled over by the cops? And she went, if the cops pull us over, me not having a license is the least of our worries. But I said, how about you just drive on the side roads, not the main ones? And she went along with that until she worked out, sorry, you won't like this part. Why would the boy imagine she liked any part of this story? Me and Zoe tell each other everything, okay? So I had to tell her I didn't have a license either. I mean, I used to have one, got cancelled, speeding fines. He flinched as he looked over at Celia. I thought Zoe would crack the shits, but she laughed. I mean, she whacked me around the head a bit, but she was laughing when she did it. She reckoned my mum would go berserk if she knew that. Celia wasn't delighted to know that her daughter had been driven around the country by an unlicensed, speeding idiot. But much more than that, she was stung by the image of those two sharing laughter about her. Kieran started to yabber with a trace of his old enthusiastic energy. But yeah, anyway, then we went after the picking work. Zoe knew the places we should try. Like, she worked out the circuit we could go on. No matter where we went, Zoe could suss people out really quick. She's excellent at dealing with people, isn't she? She's so fucking smart. Talking about Zoe made the boy happy, and he smiled at Celia. Celia didn't smile back. So, you found picking work? She asked. Yeah, heaps. Enough for what we needed. And what? You two stayed in pubs or bunkhouses on the properties? No. She didn't want to do that. No, thought Celia, because Zoe would have known her mother could more easily find them if they stayed on the farms. We bought camping stuff from a disposal store, Kieran explained. He seemed proud of their self-reliant purchases, and he grinned as he went on to describe their routine. At the end of each workday, he and Zoe would buy food and then drive around until they found a pretty spot by a creek or a river to set up camp. That way, they could wash their clothes in the creek and wash the sweat off themselves. They'd make a fire to cook on, or just because it was lovely to have a fire. The evening light lasted long enough for them to eat a meal and stay up a while. with the car windows wound down so they could hear music from the radio. It was warm enough, at least in the early weeks, for the two of them to sleep outside in their swags. Zoe had bought a small alarm clock to wake them up early enough to have a swim before another day of picking. "You could have kept going like that," said Celia. Yeah, we could have. But Zoe said we should go to Sydney." I went, "Why? This is good. Let's keep doing this for a bit longer." But she really wanted to go to Sydney, and I wanted her to be happy. So, but I'm not making excuses. I should have known it was a bad idea. Why a bad idea? Kieran kept talking as if he hadn't heard that. "Sydney can be a top place. We stayed with mates of mine, and most of the time to start with, things were good. I tried to make everything good for Zoe. I want you to know that." Celia said nothing and waited until Kieran felt obliged to fill the silence. Zoe started getting really down sometimes. Not all the time, but some days. "I should have worked out what to do so she'd never ever have to feel so..." But, oh man, she could get dark. "Everything is stuffed. I'm a bad person. Everyone dies. So what's the point? I deserve to die because I'm a bad person." I'd go, "Come on, Zoe, don't be so down, baby. We're the lucky ones. I've seen people be slack or straight out cruel to the exact people they're supposed to be looking after. I knew what me and Zoe had was good because I've seen the other ways it can be. And most of the time, I could goof around, make her laugh, we'd have some fun and she'd cheer up. But some days, far out, she'd sink into a hole so deep, you couldn't even yell down to her." Celia could hear Kieran's voice rasp as the tears came, but she said nothing. She had seen Zoe sink into the occasional sad funk, but she hadn't thought her daughter had the capacity for such black moods. Now Celia found herself replaying scenes from the last year, wondering if Zoe had been struggling, wretched, but keeping it to herself. Marcus, Zoe's father, had generally been a buoyant man, but sometimes he'd tumbled down into a gloomy state, sluggish, hopeless. He wouldn't discuss it with anyone, even with Celia, only a little. And he would keep going, doing whatever he was obliged to do, but only by pushing himself. Celia would determinedly interrogate everything that had happened, everything she'd said, anything that could explain his misery. If you could understand the cause of something, you could fix it, or at least avoid being vulnerable to it in the future. But Marcus always assured her there was no use searching for a reason, at least, not a reason commensurate with the level of his melancholy. "Wait it out," he would say, but Celia would always continue to fret and question and analyse until her husband's regular upbeat, energetic self came back to her. "I didn't know what to do for Zoe," said Kieran, "and I thought if we could drive up north, where it's warm, so we'd get back to the way it was, put ourselves back into a proper rhythm. A person's got to have some sunlight on their body, and Zoe was up for it, so we could make things good again. But we needed money, for petrol and maybe a better car than Sheena's bomb if we were going to drive right up to North Queensland. I was so desperate to get Zoe somewhere better, I didn't think straight. My mate Mick always knows how to get money together fast, so I asked him. I thought it'd be okay, but Mick, he's not a good person." Kieran was crying, contorting his face so much. Some of the cuts reopened, and blood was beading on his forehead again. "What happened?" asked Celia. "Mick knew where some guy kept big rolls of cash in his house. Massive house, on this 5-acre place near Durrell. Mick reckoned the owners were away, so it'd be snack easy. I never wanted Zoe to be there. 'No way are you coming,' I said. But she said, 'I want to make sure things don't get out of hand.' She didn't trust me not to be a dickhead when I was around Mick." "So she went with you and Mick to the place?" "Yeah, I knew that was probably a mistake. It was a mistake." The boy hesitated for a moment, but Celia gestured, "Keep going." "Okay, so We drove out to the house in Sheena's car, he went on. No one home. Mick was right about that part, but he didn't know they had guard dogs. Big, black, vicious Rottweilers. 2 of them. They were barking like crazy and giving Mick the shits. And then Zoe got upset because Mick hurt the dogs. She got so upset she took the car and pissed off, which was good because Mick was going spare, especially when it turned out there was no money. He started smashing stuff up, pushed my face into the broken glass on the floor, and then there was so much blood in my eyes I couldn't see properly. I just ran out the door, up to the main road. Anyway, I was glad Zoe was safely out of that place. The last you saw of her, she was okay? She got bitten on the hand by one of the dogs. Mostly she was shaken up about Mick hurting the dogs. And she was mad with me. But she was okay, yeah. Then later on, I couldn't find her. I figured she'd driven home. That's why I came here. She'll come home. That's why I'm here.
This is the end of CD 5. The book continues on CD 6. CD 5.
"14. Celia was behaving as if she'd arranged to meet someone in the foyer of the pancake parlour, so her presence wouldn't appear odd to the customers or staff. She'd brought her daughter to this pancake place once when she was 12 as a special Sydney treat. Zoe had been fizzy with excitement about every detail: the flamboyant menus, the booths, the extravagant piles of gooey food. Celia pictured the scenario of Zoe bringing Kieran to this same pancake parlour, the 2 of them laughing and relishing the nostalgic fun of it, eager to share this moment from her past. Celia could easily imagine her doing that. Of course, the odds of Zoe turning up here on this particular Sunday were impossibly low, ridiculous, beyond all logic. But trying something was preferable to waiting with nothing. A teenage couple on an excruciatingly awkward first date ventured into the restaurant, but it was mostly families arriving for early dinners, special occasion dinners. The little kids were thrilled and uncomfortable to be dressed up in their scratchy best outfits as their parents wrangled them to queue up behind the "Please wait here to be seated" sign. When a hostess signalled to a family group to follow her, with a stack of oversized menus tucked under her arm, the children gasped as if they were being escorted towards some indescribably exotic wonderland. While Celia waited, the crowd grew and she had to keep shuffling out of the way. "Excuse me, sorry. Please, you go past me. No, I'm not in the queue. I'm just waiting for someone." She'd been maintaining her rounds of the city. In a cycle of 2 or 3 days, she would loiter outside places Kieran frequented, according to Sheena's notes, then find a chair in the waiting area of a hospital casualty department for an hour or 2, then walk through areas of town the young couple might hang out. In recent weeks, she had added new locations to her search sequence. Places that might draw Zoe's interest: the beach, the art gallery, movie theatres on George Street. But Celia could only guess. She couldn't be sure what kinds of things would interest Zoe now. When Celia was in her teens, she never expected her parents to understand what went on in her head. She considered herself to be swimming along a very different channel to them, even while occupying the same house. Both her mother and father had been born at the beginning of the century, and so much in the world had changed, leaving parents and children with few shared points of reference. Her parents were formal people, reserved, slightly bewildered by the modern world, operating from a framework so old-fashioned they didn't really comprehend that it was old-fashioned. There was love in their family, without doubt, but no assumption of understanding or common ground. Her brother, 5 years older, had left home straight after school, taking a job with an oil company in Scotland, and it felt as if Celia was left living in a house with 2 people who spoke a different language. She mostly relied on the cheerful nodding and clumsy miming gestures used to convey goodwill to foreigners. There was no chance any nuances of experience could be communicated. That was how it had seemed to Celia at the time, anyway. Now, she accepted that she couldn't have known what was going on in her parents' minds, what they did and didn't understand about their child.
CD 6.
"19. Zoe floated just below the surface, trying to push upwards to be fully awake. But at the same time, she was so very tired, limbs aching, head heavy with fatigue. It was easier to sink back down into sleep again. She was in her own room at home. No need to open her eyes to know the position of the bed under the window and the location of every object on the white painted desk, the posters on the blue walls, treasures on the windowsill. She rolled onto her side and became aware of dampness on the mattress. The smell, a sharp ammonia smell, disturbed her enough to register she must have wet herself, and then to recall she wasn't in her own bed. The bare mattress was on a linoleum floor, alongside milk crates full of empty bottles and old newspapers. She wasn't clear-headed enough to remember where this room was, but she definitely wasn't home. And she knew she was alone and ill, febrile, shivering, heart tapping out a rapid, tinny beat. She should get up off the mattress, wash herself, but she was too feeble to stand up. She wanted to be home. She could never face going home. She wanted Kieran to walk through the door. She wanted the door to be bolted shut so she could hide from everyone. She wanted her mother to appear and nurse her back to health. She wanted to die in this place, unseen, so she would never have to be seen by anyone, and it would all be over. Sinking back down into the fever sleep, she found more noxious dreams waiting there for her. One night, months ago, not long after she and Kieran had first arrived in Sydney, Zoe had woken up, shaken by a dream. Kieran had scooped her in against him. "You okay, baby? Having a nightmare? Tell me about it. That's the trick. That way you can get the nightmare out of your head and gone." Zoe murmured, "No," but Kieran held her tight, urged her to tell him. So she described the dream in which she'd been walking through some kind of car park. "The other people wandering around the car park, I knew they were dead. The way you can just know stuff in a dream. Yeah, I get you. I recognised faces," Zoe explained. "The lady who used to run the kiosk at the pool. This kid from primary school who died. My father was there too." Zoe had often looked at photos of Marcus, dead before she was born, but she never imagined her father as a dead person. "Maybe it's a beautiful thing," Kieran suggested. "You seeing your dad like that." Zoe could tell Kieran didn't get it. Nothing about that dream was beautiful. "There were others," she said. "People who aren't dead yet, only in the dream they were. Everyone's internal organs were turning liquid like soup. Then I saw you and me, sprawled out." Zoe didn't give Kieran any detail. Didn't tell him that she'd seen their bodies rotting in front of her like a sped-up movie, like time-lapse photography on a nature program. The two of them decomposing, liquefying, until there was nothing except a greasy slick staining the concrete. Kieran ran his hands up and down Zoe's warm flesh. "We're not dead. Look at us." "But we will die, that's the truth of it. We won't die. One day." "But not now," Kieran said. "Here we are." He wrapped his arms around her, as if he would hold her in life with him that way. "Don't have dreams like that. Wake me up next time. I'll stop that horrible stuff filling up your head." He peppered Zoe's forehead with a dozen kisses. She had stopped sharing her bad dreams and her bad thoughts with Kieran. He didn't understand, and it would just upset him if she pushed to make him understand. There were occasions when she would be feeling low, and Kieran would be so bouncy, so perky, it annoyed the shit out of her. She'd snap at him, and then a second later, feel lousy about letting her misery infect his beautiful spirit. Then she would be even more disgusted by herself. She was a repulsive and stupid person, so stupid she was dangerous. It would be just as well if she decomposed into a gelatinous pile that could seep into this mattress and disappear. Zoe. Someone was saying her name repeatedly, nudging her shoulder. Zoe opened her eyes to see Sheena crouching beside her. "What have you taken?" Sheena asked. "Nothing." That was true. For weeks now, Zoe had steered clear of any substances, even booze. When they were on the picking circuit, camping out, Kieran and Zoe had got pissed a few times on port. Zoe tried smoking joints, but because she'd never been a cigarette smoker, she just coughed, and that was a waste of good weed. In Sydney, Kieran had been anxious about the drugs floating around, wanting her to be cautious, but Zoe had a list of things to try. To begin with, she had enjoyed the way speed fizzed through her veins, and the warm, cushiony, boneless torpor from the downers. Her one go at a hallucinogen was too frightening to repeat. She was afraid the distortion might never wear off, as if mechanisms inside her could twist permanently out of shape. She wasn't like Kieran. He could get wasted, but he always bounced back. For Zoe, the come down was too harsh. Her disposition too unsteady, her capacity for darkness unknowable. The risk was there that she might never come back from one of those black moods. She couldn't explain this to Kieran, so she just tried to laugh about it with him. "I want to be a wild girl, but I'm no good at it." Kieran said he didn't care, that she was his spectacular girl no matter what. But then Zoe felt guilty. Wouldn't he prefer to get wasted with his friends rather than sit around nursing the hangovers or managing the freakouts of his piss-weak girlfriend? "No way. I'd rather be with you anytime, anywhere. We don't need anything else." Kieran was right. When the two of them were together, and it was good, they hadn't needed anyone else. But now everything was messed up. Suddenly Zoe was swamped by that sensation that she had unbuckled inside and might never be able to reassemble herself into one coherent piece. Cold! The shock of the cold water was like a blow to the head. Sheena had stripped off Zoe's fever-sweated clothes and put her under the shower. Sheena hadn't planned to shove Zoe under a dead cold shower, but the electricity had been cut off to this house, so cold it was. She couldn't deny there was a scrap of satisfaction in subjecting the stupid girl to a blast of icy water. As she'd promised Joe, Sheena had gone looking for Kieran. She asked around, quizzing the losers her brother called his friends, but those guys had no useful information to offer. No one had seen Kieran or his pretty blonde girlfriend for a couple of weeks, to the extent that those morons could be expected to have an accurate sense of the passage of time. Sheena checked out various places Kieran had lived, hoping to track him down. As a last resort, she tried this huge old Darlinghurst terrace. Kieran and her second youngest brother had lived here for a while, way back when their mother was shacked up with a truck driver who wanted to live near the depot. Sheena knew that Kieran and Mick had sometimes squatted in the house when they needed to stay off the radar. The place was empty now. Any squatters turfed out, because the house was due to be gutted and then transformed into one of the dolled-up, renovated terraces appearing along this street. Sheena had almost walked away without bothering to look inside, but then she spotted a side window wedged open, and she climbed in. Pushing open the door to each room, she felt queasy, with a fear that she was about to confront the sight of her brother's dead body. In an upstairs bedroom, tucked behind crates of rubbish, she saw Zoe. There was a sting of disappointment to find her and not Kieran. Then again, it was a fucking relief she was alive. Sheena wouldn't want to be lumbered with the responsibility that her brother had contributed to the silly girl's death. Slicing through the musty fug in the room was a stink of piss. The kid had wet herself. Sheena's first thought was that Zoe was off her face on something, but when she knelt down, she saw the girl shivering violently and her forehead was hot to touch, like a child with tonsillitis that no one had been taking care of. Sheena then saw the reason for the infection burning through the girl. Dog bites on her right hand, infected so the skin was red and swollen, shiny tight, with pus oozing from the puncture wounds. She needed to strip off Zoe's scungy clothes, haul her into the bathroom along the corridor, and bring her temperature down quickly. There were a couple of batik sarongs tacked up as curtaining in the front bedroom of the terrace. The fabric was dusty, but cleaner than anything else to hand. So Sheena ripped the sarongs down and used one as a towel to dry Zoe off after the shower. The girl stood naked on the tiles, shivering with cold as much as the fever, limp, compliant. She allowed Sheena to turn her, lift her arms, rub the sarong over her legs and buttocks and breasts, too ill or wretched to care beyond any modesty. Sheena bound Zoe's long hair in the damp sarong, then twisted it up on top of her head. Sheena took off her own shirt, she was wearing a t-shirt underneath, and eased Zoe's arms into the shirt sleeves, careful not to touch her poor infected hand. She tied the other dry sarong around Zoe's lower half. She had sluiced the bite wounds, a little bit cleaner in the water, but they were still lurid red and weeping pus. She had nothing hygienic enough to bandage them and figured it was best to leave them to air dry until she could get proper medical treatment. "Is Kieran here?" Sheena asked. Zoe shook her head. "Do you know where he is?" Zoe shook her head again. Then she murmured, "I don't understand. I was looking for Kieran, found you. I don't understand why you're helping me. You hate me. You think I think you're a selfish little bitch who doesn't have any clue how lucky she is." Sheena sat Zoe on top of the toilet seat and unwrapped the sarong on her head. She used her own brush to smooth the knots out of the girl's long, wet hair. That was when she copped a proper look at Zoe's neck, the mottled plum-coloured marks staining the milky skin of her throat. Sheena hated asking, but she had to ask. "Did Kieran do that?" "Mick." "Is Mick hanging around here too?" "No." "And your hand? Those are dog bites?" "Yes, dogs." Zoe refused to go to the police or a hospital. When Sheena pushed the idea, the girl started to cry, gulping for breath between sobs and pleading. Okay, settle down," Sheena relented. "But we have to get your hand fixed up. Stay there a sec, don't fucking move." She ran downstairs to the kitchen and fetched an old teacup, then found Zoe's sneakers lying on the lino floor of the small bedroom. She filled the teacup with water and handed it to Zoe, who was still sitting on the toilet seat, obedient, or maybe just too feeble to move. "Keep taking little sips. Don't guzzle it or you might chuck up," Sheena instructed. She eased Zoe's bare feet into the sneakers and tied up the laces. It was awkward, tying up the shoelaces on another person, and she was hit by the memory of putting on Kieran's school shoes when he was a little boy. Fucking Kieran. If he hadn't pinched her car, Sheena would have had transport to cart his stupid girlfriend to medical attention. As it was, the best she could do was drape her own padded nylon jacket around the girl's shoulders and steer her down the stairs. There was no way Zoe had the strength to climb out the side window, so Sheena forced open the boarded-up front door. The wood on the doorframe was so termite-chewed and crumbly that the nails gave way easily with 2 sharp kicks. Sheena let herself relish the satisfying burst of violence it required. She was hoping to hail a cab on the street, but typical of her shit luck, there were no cabs in sight. As they walked along the footpath, Sheena held Zoe upright and steady, with an arm around her waist, making sure not to brush against her injured hand. People were staring at the two of them, the scrawny woman with bottle black hair, just wearing jeans and a t-shirt despite the cold day, supporting the teenage girl in a grubby sarong, with wet hair dripping down the back of a nylon jacket. a string of neck bruises, and lurid puncture wounds on one hand. Let those fuckers stare and think whatever they liked. Sheena didn't care. Luckily, the medical practice Sheena remembered was still on this street, 2 blocks down. And luckily, it wasn't the kind of GP surgery with responsible, cosy family doctors who might ask questions. This was a kind of walk-in off-the-street clinic where the dozy quacks didn't remember one patient from the next and would write a prescription for Valium or Pethidine without even looking up from the prescription pad to eyeball the loser they were giving the drugs to. Sheena spoke to the woman at the front desk and then parked Zoe on a chair in the waiting area. There were several individuals already sitting there, unsanitary types who looked as if they had germy spores flaking off their skin and were exhaling bacteria through their mouths into the shared air and straight into the open wounds of a teenage girl who shouldn't be in such a shithole in the first place. Sheena realised she was instinctively leaning forward and sideways as if she could use her body to shield the sick girl from being infected by these people. When it was Zoe's turn, Sheena steered her into the consulting room, trying to devise a plausible story for the doctor. She need not have bothered. The GP was an old dude, obviously over the job, and possibly without a complete set of marbles rolling around in his head. The doc didn't care why this teenager had choke marks round her neck and untreated dog bites. He squinted at Zoe's hand as if he were half blind, then he yanked her arm closer, making the kid gasp with the pain of his clumsy fingers on her poor swollen hand. "They're dog bites," Sheena said sharply. "Need to be flushed out and disinfected, yeah?" Yes, that would be... How about I do that part myself later?" Sheena didn't want this incompetent codger hurting Zoe any more than was necessary. "But I need you to write us a prescription for whichever antibiotic you give a person who's been bitten by a dog." The guy eventually scrawled what was needed on a script pad, and then the practice nurse, very pleased with herself in her white zip-up uniform, took Zoe into a side cubicle to do the dressings on her hand, just as well. Sheena had bandaged plenty of cuts and burns and injuries over the years, but better if the job was done by a qualified person who knew what they were doing. 20. Zoe was strapped down, tied to the bed, but twisting sideways, she realised there weren't any ties. It was just the sheets tucked neatly around her. Crisp, white, citrus-scented sheets on a huge bed. She lifted her head enough to see she was in a posh hotel room, with wood panelling, caramel fabric on the armchair and curtains, glossy brown ceramic table lamps, framed botanical prints. She had no idea how long she'd been sleeping, but she felt stronger for it. She was bundled up in a soft toweling bathrobe, and her hand was bandaged, still aching but not burning up like before. It was a relief to be somewhere quiet and clean. It was a relief not to have to answer any questions or make any decisions. When they first came to Sydney, Kieran had tried to make it good for her, as if he was the one who had persuaded her to dive into the city. In fact, it had been Zoe's idea. Kieran had wanted to stay away from his old mates, keep travelling, doing the picking work. They started out couch surfing at houses where his friends lived, a couple of crumbly old terraces close to the city, but mostly places in the suburbs out west. Their car, well, Sheena's car really, felt more like their home, their own little piece of the world, than any house they stayed in. The bomby car had been handling all those road miles fairly well, especially once Kieran found a guy to replace the barrel on the ignition so they didn't need to wire start it every time. As Kieran drove them from one house to another, Zoe gave up trying to keep the map of those endlessly spreading distant suburbs clear in her head. The place they finally ended up was a shabby fibro house in Toongabbie, with half a dozen cars parked across the front lawn and the backyard choked with waist-high summer weeds that died off in the winter and flattened into a dry, grey carpet around the hill's hoist. At some point in the past, many of the paintable surfaces had been slathered with thick coats of matte black paint. Kitchen cupboards, bathroom tiles, bedroom wallpaper, doors and window frames. The black was now scratched and in some places scraped off, revealing the pastel kitchen cupboards, swirly Laminex benchtop and mint green tiling underneath. Zoe never understood who owned the house or which people officially lived in it, but there was always at least one person sprawled on the nubbly beige nylon sofa, watching the TV set resting on a milk crate. Any time, day or night, an occupant of the house would squawk at whoever was playing music too loud on the cassette player in the kitchen. From the start, she was curious about Kieran's mates as well as a small number of girlfriends who drifted in and out of that house. She wanted to know their stories, to inhale every detail of their experiences, to discover how it would feel on her skin to enter their magnetic field. Trouble was, she didn't dare ask questions of anyone in case she revealed herself as naive and stupid. But if she kept quiet, no one noticed she was younger, a soft creature with no streetwise gristle to her, or if they noticed, they didn't care. She had to acknowledge that she had been harbouring fantasies of being sucked into a darkly glamorous bohemian underworld, as if she might walk into a 1930s Berlin bordello or be ushered through a secret entrance to an intoxicating New York nightclub. She had always relied too much on novels to picture the world. This fibro house, these guys with their flannel shirts and homemade bongs, their girlfriends with overplucked eyebrows and cheesecloth tops, vomiting into the laundry sink. These people were not the occupants of the dangerous but seductive demi-monde Zoe had been carrying in her silly head. She did hear stories about a chick they all knew who had died of a heroin overdose last Christmas. There was something shivery thrilling about that. And she did overhear talk about drug deals and warehouse robberies, but Kieran was adamant as a person like him could be, that they should steer way clear of that kind of trouble. Even so, even if the life here was far from what she'd imagined, it still felt authentic and unfiltered and exciting compared to the anodyne city she'd been allowed to know on trips to Sydney with her mother to visit her Aunt Freya. For months, from the day after they ran off together from the farm until the day they were separated, Kieran had pestered Zoe to ring her mother. She wouldn't need to say where she was, she could just leave a message with Rosa. But apart from that one postcard at the start, Zoe never did make contact, and she forbade Kieran to do it either. At the beginning, she hung on to an urge to punish, to scream in her mother's face about the price to be paid for manipulation and mistrust. Silence was her most powerful weapon for doing that. Later, Zoe became wary, almost superstitious, about making contact. Even in Sydney, she constantly felt her mother's gaze on her, heard Celia's voice judging everything. Zoe struggled to drown it out with the loudness of this new life. And that worked sometimes. But if there was to be any chance of properly hushing the voice in her head, she couldn't contact Celia, not yet. Zoe had been finding it harder and harder to pull herself out of black moods, which was another reason she couldn't risk speaking to her mother. Celia would know. She would be able to detect in any word Zoe uttered that things were bad. And then, the longer the silence went on, the heavier the shameful load became, the sheer weight of the not ringing. She should have just left some simple phone message early on, and then she could be clear of it. She hadn't thought about it coherently, and now it was too late. But then there were times Zoe was busting to know what Celia would make of the characters her daughter was hanging out with now. She pictured the conversations the two of them would have together, speculating about people, laughing, gossiping, fretting over possible outcomes, and she could enjoy that imaginary scene. More than anything, and more urgently, Zoe wished she could hear her mother's take on Mick. Kieran's other mates were fun to hang out with, sometimes at least. It was true some of them were guys who used other people. Zoe was proud that Kieran always operated from a nice guy impulse, but then she hated seeing friends take advantage of him, always bludging lifts from him, cadging money from his cash fund, the remains of Zoe's money box plus their savings from picking fruit. She would get cranky on Kieran's behalf, protective, urging him not to let his supposed mates exploit him. He would laugh, flap his hands. "Don't worry about it. Gaz will pay me back. And you and me will be sweet no matter what." But Mick was different from the other friends. Zoe first met him in a Grandville pub, and the air had shifted the moment he stepped into the back bar. She was thankful it was a room full of bodies and noise that could soak up some of the force of this man. His dark buzz cut had a rat's tail at the back, his face bloodlessly pale like a nocturnal creature. Mick was older than Kieran. Some people said 20, other people reckoned 25, but his heavy eyebrows and the smudgy discoloration around his eyes, like permanent grey eyeshadow, made him look way older. He wasn't especially beefed up, but you could tell from the hard lines of his forearms and his sinewy neck that he had the physical power to do whatever came into his mind. He scanned the bar as he walked in, passing his reptilian eyes over every breathing person in the place. Kieran jumped to his feet the minute he saw Mick and threw one arm up in the air to grab his attention, like a fanatical soldier eager to receive his orders. Zoe had never seen him react like this to anyone else. Kieran then grabbed her elbow and steered her, well, almost pushed her, across the floor to present her to Mick. As Kieran approached, Mick yelled out, "Where you been lurking, dickwad?" "Huh, yeah, well, sorry, I was out in the bush for a while." "Yep, I heard," Mick said, with a dismissive flick of the head. He was the kind of guy who liked to know things already. Kieran grinned and did a little hopping dance, a dog eager to win favour. "So anyway, Mick, been busting for you to meet my girlfriend Zoe." Mick puckered his mouth and pushed her name through his lips with an exaggerated drawl. "Zoe." "Hi," she said, but very little voice came out. Mick scanned her body, down to her thighs and then up again to her face. "I heard about you. You're the one who's got my mate Kieran pussy whipped." Kieran laughed a bit too loud. "Steady on, Zoe's incredible." "If you say so, mate. I better keep an eye on this little skank butt." Kieran pulled Zoe closer to him, with that same nervous laugh. "He's just teasing, being a dickhead." Mick leaned forward, putting his mouth right up close to Zoe's face. "I am a dickhead. He's just teasing you." Kieran relaxed a bit after the introductions had been made. Beers were bought, stories were told, bullshit was spun, and blessedly, Mick seemed to lose interest in her. After that first meeting in the pub, Mick started turning up at the Toongabbie house. Zoe worked out early on that he liked to be regarded as unpredictable. No one was ever sure when he would show up, where he was living, how he sourced his money, which girl he might bring with him to fuck in whichever bedroom he commandeered for the night. At first, Zoe was intimidated by the girls Mick brought round, assuming they must be tough and cluey if they could handle a man like him. But it turned out they were mostly stupid drunk, or wasted, or super young, even younger than she was. Everyone reckoned Mick was the man to talk to if you wanted drugs or a cheap TV set or a gun, not that Zoe ever saw a gun at the house. Rumours about him buzzed through all the houses and pubs. Mutterings about big-time criminal connections and different versions of a story about him breaking a guy's neck with a roof rack Mick had ripped off the bloke's own car. "You don't want to believe half that shit," Kieran said. "People like telling stories about him." But even Kieran agreed when people said Mick overdid the speed. "Yeah, look, he's a wound-up customer even when he's straight, so doing so much crank isn't the best idea," Kieran acknowledged. Mick ignored Zoe any time he appeared at the house to hang out with Kieran, and that suited her. But unexpectedly, for no reason that Zoe could decipher, she would find him watching her. He might be lying on the carpet, sleeping off a big night, but then, with no sound, he would open his lizard eyes and aim them at her. "You don't want to pay attention to the shit he goes on with," Kieran said. "He's all noise." The two guys had been friends since they were kids, and Mick had helped Kieran out of shitty situations more than once. There hadn't been many people Kieran could count on back then, especially in the time before he found Zoe. So Kieran owed Mick his loyalty and wanted to be a staunch friend. She got that. But even so, how could he make excuses when he saw Mick bash one of their mates or treat his girlfriends like garbage? Nothing she said seemed to shake the spell Mick had over him, and that scared her. Whenever it was Zoe and Kieran alone together, everything was better. They could retreat to their small bedroom and Kieran would wedge a chair under the door handle to ensure no out-of-it dickhead could come barging in looking for a soft corner to crash. And after they had sex in the narrow bed against the black-painted wall, Zoe could handle anything, even Mick. There was a time, just a few weeks ago, when Zoe hadn't been able to sleep for several nights in a row. She would leave Kieran in bed while she wandered the house until morning. So the next evening, she tried swallowing a few gulps of Bundy, hoping it would help her drift into sleep once she flaked out in bed. It didn't help, and the inside of her skull was even more glutinous by the time Mick showed up at the Toongabbie house. One of the girls said Mick had sourced some PCP. Zoe didn't know if that was true, but it didn't matter. Mick was cranked up, lying on the floor, stretching his hands over his face, and staring incessantly at Zoe through the gaps in his fingers, terrifying her. For once, thankfully, Kieran could see it for himself. He grabbed her hand and led her into their room. As Kieran wedged the chair under the door, Zoe stood there, swaying, dizzy. The floor was rolling under her feet, folding in on itself like boiling water. "The ground keeps moving," she murmured. Kieran took her hands and eased her down to sit on the floor. "It's not moving. It's solid. See?" He grabbed a jumper off the bed to drape around her shoulders in case she was cold. "You need to sleep. Awake too many days at a stretch, it does your head in. And yeah, look, Mick's being a spaz tonight. I know that. I don't know what's wrong with him. I mean, you're right, baby. He's a worry, that guy." Zoe couldn't handle talking about Mick right now. If she could just sleep, she might be able to think clearly. Then Kieran said, "I should have never brought you to Sydney." "What? Don't make it sound like I'm a little girl you led astray." No, I never said that." Zoe flared at him. "I wanted to come here, didn't I?" "You did. So what are you saying?" "I'm saying this place isn't right for us. We should have kept it just you and me. We never had fights before we came here." That was true. Not a single argument when they were on the road. But now there were more and more fights that could fly out of control until there was crying and shouting. They argued about Kieran letting people scrounge off him. They argued about Mick. They argued about Zoe's unfathomable moods. Kieran complained that she didn't confide in him anymore, which made him feel paranoid and distant from her. Usually, any bad temper between them would crumble quickly. They'd end up having a weepy, passionate fuck, and it would be good again. This night, maybe it was the ugly vibe Mick had brought to the house with him. The tension was spun up higher than usual. Zoe hated hearing the shrill edge in her own voice, but she couldn't stop. "Don't make it sound like I'm some silly girl who can't handle the big nasty world." "Zoe, I'm not doing that. Why are you saying this stuff?" "That's what you think, isn't it? You reckon I'm some hopeless—" "No. You think I've wrecked everything. You're saying—" "No. What do you want me to say? Fuck, Zoe, fuck." Kieran's spark of anger, the way he slammed the words at her, landed like a slap across the face. "You hate me," she said. "Don't talk shit. I don't hate you." "Yeah, you hate me." "I don't know what you want me to do." His anger was gone as quickly as it had flared, and now his voice was thick with tears. "Should I take you back home?" "I knew it. You want to get rid of me. You wish you'd never laid eyes on me." Kieran grabbed her face in his hands. No. The day I laid eyes on you was the most perfect day. The day I realised something could be so good." And suddenly, like an unexpected rescue, Zoe was able to grab hold of how much she loved him. "I'm sorry," she said. She kissed him gently, again and again. "You're not sorry you ever came with me?" Kieran asked. She would never be sorry. She had to make him understand that. No. I wouldn't want to miss out on anything. I dragged you down. Don't say that. You didn't. That was the night they decided to leave the house. Just the two of them. Plan a trip north, somewhere warm, and make things good again. Now lying on the clean white hotel sheets, Zoe had no clue if Kieran was even still alive. She started to cry, which made her bruised throat hurt even more. A moment later, the door into the hotel bedroom eased open. "You're awake," said Sheena, who must have heard the crying. She walked over to Zoe and refilled a glass on the bedside table from a bottle of Lucozade. "You look terrible. Keep drinking this stuff." "Have you called my mother?" Zoe asked. "Well, I phoned Joe. He booked this room so you could have a sleep." "Do you know where Kieran is?" "No." "Would you tell me if you knew?" "Look, I have zero idea. All I know is the cops found my car." Zoe nodded. She felt Sheena's eyes on her. "They mentioned what police officers like to call serious matters," said Sheena. "But they wouldn't say more than that." Zoe hauled herself up onto the pillows and took a sip of Lucozade. The syrupy yellow stuff was soothing, even if swallowing was painful. "I know you blame me," said Zoe. "And you're right. It's because of me everything got messed up. Don't flatter yourself, sweetheart. My brother would have got himself into major shit without any inspiration from you. It's my fault we even went to the Durrell house. Kieran only came up with the plan to travel north because he was worried about me. Money would be no problem when they got themselves up the coast. They'd be picking work to earn what they needed. But Kieran reckoned they needed an escape fund to start them off and extra money to buy a more reliable car. He said Mick would know a way we could get some quick cash." Sheena groaned. Jesus fucking Christ. The three of them had driven in Sheena's car beyond the edge of the proper suburbs, into an area where the few remaining market gardens were giving way to 5-acre blocks with sprawling, show-offy houses. Mick directed them up the driveway of a property with elaborate but still raw landscaping and an enormous new house built to look like a French chateau. When the guard dog started barking, Mick went ballistic. Kieran kept saying to me, "Don't worry, he's just a bit amped up. It'll be okay." Mick was smashing the glass panels around the front door with a sledgehammer, but the whole time the dogs kept barking. To shut them up, he started hitting them with the sledgehammer. I tried to pull the dogs away so they wouldn't get hurt. "That's how you got bitten?" Zoe nodded. "I couldn't help them anyway." Shaken by the bites, Zoe had retreated into the garden and Kieran rushed over to her. That was when Mick clobbered the Rottweilers until they went down, then continued swinging the sledgehammer until their heads were pulpy masses of fur and brain and fragments of bone spread across the sandstone porch. One of the dogs was convulsing, the hind legs twitching with its few last spasms. Zoe reached down to hold the leg, with some ridiculous impulse to soothe the poor animal. Too angry to cry, she kept screaming at Kieran, "Look what he's done!" Mick went inside the house, yelling for Kieran to follow him. "Let's go, Kieran. Let's just go," Zoe hissed. Kieran was jittery, in shock about Mick killing the dogs. Let me just think a sec." "What? Think about what?" "We have to go." He held the car keys out to her. "You go, you take the car, that's safer, and you poor hand, you should go." Mick was calling, "Kieran! Kieran!" in drawn-out yowling sounds, yelling the name over and over. Kieran scrunched up his face, trying to shut out that howling voice, trying to think clearly. "Look, I reckon I should stay, Better make sure Mick doesn't do anything else. I mean, someone has to. I just need to think. Fuck you, Kieran. Are you crazy? Are you an idiot? Shut up a sec. Shut up and let me think. No, I'm the idiot for coming here, for believing the shit you say, for ever being with a moron like you. Zoe snatched the keys from Kieran's hand and hurried to the car. She thought he might follow her, but he didn't. She would take care of herself. She drove back down the driveway and turned onto the road that would eventually take her to the highway. But she'd only travelled a short distance when the car conked out. She clung to the steering wheel and gave in to a fit of sobbing about the dogs, the horrible things she'd said to Kieran, the whole mess she should never have allowed to happen. She was a terrible person to leave Kieran stranded with Mick. She tried to start the engine one more time, but it just gave up a guttural scraping noise. She jumped out of the vehicle and ran back along the road to the big house. But by the time she reached the big house, Kieran had disappeared.
This is the end of CD6. The book continues on CD7.